Right now, satellites are silently drifting over your head. Not one or two, but thousands. Most of them are harmless, delivering internet, tracking weather patterns, helping planes navigate across oceans. But a select few exist for more ominous purposes: to observe, monitor, and in some cases control. They can read the label on a bottle from orbit. They can track a single individual walking through a forest. And some of them may never show up on any public satellite registry. For decades, military and intelligence satellites have been watching the world, shaping conflicts, altering geopolitics, and raising uncomfortable questions about privacy, autonomy, and power. Their full capabilities are rarely known. Let's look at a side of space technology that people don't often think about. From balloons to black orbits, the hidden evolution of reconnaissance platforms. In the mid-19th century, long before satellites orbited the Earth, humans were already looking for ways to see farther and higher than ever before. Observation from above wasn't a new idea, but the means to do it were still limited. What started as simple experiments with hot air balloons eventually grew into one of the most secretive and advanced areas of technology: reconnaissance from space. During the American Civil War in the 1860s, balloons were used by both Union and Confederate forces to observe enemy troop movements. These early reconnaissance platforms were little more than canvas balloons filled with gas, tethered to the ground, carrying observers with binoculars or sketch pads. It was primitive, but it gave armies a new way to see the battlefield. They could now look down from hundreds of feet in the air, an entirely new perspective. The idea caught on. Over the next few decades, military planners and inventors pushed to improve balloon-based observation. Some fitted cameras to these platforms, but the results were mixed. Early photographic equipment was bulky and delicate. Wind and motion made it hard to capture sharp images. Still, the potential was clear. If you could get a camera high enough, you could map enemy positions, monitor infrastructure, and even track movements without ever being on the ground. Around the turn of the 20th century, another odd but clever idea took shape: using pigeons. Inventor Julius Neubronner, a German pharmacist, designed a lightweight camera small enough to strap onto a pigeon's chest. The bird would fly along its usual route, and the camera, set with a simple timer, would take photos as it soared over the land below. It sounds quaint today, but in a time before drones or satellites, this was an early form of aerial intelligence gathering. The photos were grainy and often tilted or blurred, but they represented a real breakthrough: hands-free, high-up photography that could be done quietly and without human risk. World War I saw further development of balloon-based surveillance, but it also marked the dawn of another leap: aircraft. Pilots flying over enemy lines with handheld cameras began to change the way militaries thought about intelligence. Reconnaissance became a mission, not just a hopeful experiment. Planes could fly farther and faster than balloons, and new cameras were being developed specifically for high-altitude work. By World War II, aerial photography had become a science. Specialized reconnaissance aircraft flew dangerous missions deep into enemy territory, snapping detailed images of fortifications, troop convoys, and industrial targets. But even aircraft had limitations. Weather, anti-aircraft fire, and human error made every mission a gamble. There was a constant need to go higher, faster, and more secretly. As rocket technology began to emerge in the 1940s and 1950s, visionaries began to imagine something truly different: placing observation platforms in space. The Cold War pushed this idea into reality. With the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957, the space age had officially begun. The United States quickly followed with its own satellites, and behind the scenes, secret programs were underway to use space for reconnaissance. The first real success came with the Corona program. It was classified at the time and remained secret for decades. Corona satellites were designed to orbit the Earth and take photographs of Soviet missile sites, military bases, and more. These satellites carried film-based cameras that would eject their capsules back to Earth in small canisters. These canisters would parachute down and be snatched mid-air by aircraft, an incredible feat that combined precision engineering with spycraft. The earliest Corona missions in the late 1950s and early 1960s could only capture objects the size of a large building. But as the technology improved, the resolution got sharper. Engineers developed better lenses, more stable satellite platforms, and more sensitive film. By the 1970s, Corona satellites could photograph objects just a few feet across from hundreds of miles up in orbit. Meanwhile, optical technology was leaping forward. Ground-based telescopes were being adapted for space use. Cameras that had once required physical film were moving toward digital sensors. Satellites no longer needed to eject film capsules. They could now beam data directly back to Earth using secure radio links. This real-time capability changed everything. Intelligence agencies no longer had to wait days or weeks to see what a satellite had captured. The need for higher resolution and greater secrecy continued to drive innovation. Some satellite designs were so advanced that they used mirror systems similar to astronomical telescopes. These mirrors had to be perfectly shaped and positioned to focus on targets from hundreds of kilometers away. The smallest movement or temperature change could throw them off. Despite the challenges, the payoff was worth it. Sub-meter resolution imagery, capable of identifying a vehicle, a runway, or even a hatch on a submarine. All of this, the precision, the stability, the ability to focus on a single building from space, owes as much to the early tinkerers with balloons and pigeons as it does to Cold War urgency. The goals remained the same, to see what others didn't want seen. But the methods evolved in ways no one in the 19th century could have imagined. Even today, the most powerful reconnaissance satellites remain classified. Details about their size, orbits, and capabilities are closely guarded. But based on public data and expert analysis, some can resolve details as small as 10 centimeters, sharp enough to read markings on a runway or spot a camouflage tank beneath a tree canopy. These platforms orbit silently above the planet, following predictable paths, capturing images in multiple spectra, and feeding their data into networks of analysts and decision makers. Modern commercial satellites now offer a taste of what was once top secret. Companies like Maxar and Planet Labs operate constellations that can produce sharp, color images of almost any spot on Earth. What was once the domain of military intelligence is now available to journalists, scientists, and the public. But the roots go back to canvas balloons, fragile film, and brave guesses. Corona, Hexagon, and beyond. America's secret Cold War eyes in the sky. The launch of America's first real spy satellites didn't come with a grand announcement. There were no press releases, no televised countdowns. Instead, the mission was kept under heavy secrecy, hidden behind layers of false names and official denials. In 1960, when the first successful images came back from a satellite high above the Earth, very few people even knew what Corona was. The Corona program was the United States' answer to a growing problem during the Cold War, the inability to reliably see what the Soviet Union was building. U-2 spy planes had been flying missions over Soviet territory since the late 1950s, but the risk was high. In May 1960, a U-2 flown by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace. That incident pushed US officials to lean more heavily on satellites. They needed a way to see without being seen. Corona satellites were built under the name Discoverer, which the public was told was a space science program. NASA even helped maintain the illusion, releasing false mission goals and vague scientific statements. But the true purpose was very different. These satellites carried cameras, not lab equipment. Their real job was to take photographs of Soviet missile fields, air bases, and nuclear sites, then return the film to Earth. Each satellite carried spools of photographic film that would be exposed as the satellite passed over areas of interest. After several orbits, the film would be reeled into a re-entry capsule about the size of a trash can and ejected from the satellite. This capsule would fall back through Earth's atmosphere and deploy a parachute. Special recovery planes, flying at high altitudes, would intercept the falling capsule and snatch it out of the sky using hooks and cables. If that failed, a beacon would guide recovery crews to wherever the capsule landed, including the ocean. The images from the Corona satellites provided views of huge missile silos, bomber fields, and hidden factories. What had once been guesses based on scattered reports or grainy air photos was now visible in detailed overhead views. With each mission, the film and camera systems improved. Resolution jumped from 40 feet to under 10 feet in less than a decade. Corona's success helped lower Cold War tensions in an unexpected way. For all the fear and suspicion between the superpowers, one of the most dangerous parts of the arms race was the uncertainty. American leaders had feared a missile gap, the idea that the Soviets might be building far more missiles than the US realized. But Corona revealed that this gap didn't exist. The Soviet arsenal was smaller than feared, and the US could now track new developments quickly. This reduced the need for blind build-up and gave analysts a real picture of Soviet capabilities. Corona ran until 1972. Over the course of its life, the program launched over 100 satellites, many of them successful. As the need for even better imagery grew, Corona was replaced by a more powerful series, Hexagon. Hexagon was never publicly known during its operational life. The name itself didn't appear in public documents. Internally, it was called KH9, with KH standing for keyhole, the code name for satellite camera systems. Hexagon was far more advanced than its predecessor. It was larger, heavier, and carried better cameras. Some were equipped with multiple film return capsules, allowing longer missions with several drops. In total, it could carry thousands of feet of film on board, enough to take wide-sweeping views and detailed shots in a single pass. It used a complex set of rotating lenses and mirrors to scan the ground in sweeping arcs. This allowed it to cover vast areas while still capturing images at high resolution. Some versions could identify objects as small as 2 to 3 feet across from 100 miles in orbit. The satellites often stayed in space for months, capturing thousands of images across every continent. The level of precision was staggering for the time. Engineers working on the program had to deal with extreme challenges, making sure the satellite remained stable, managing heat changes in orbit, and building cameras that could operate in near vacuum while moving at thousands of miles per hour. Every part had to work perfectly, because once the satellite launched, there was no way to fix it. The cameras had to survive radiation, vibration, and years of use. The film had to be strong enough to withstand constant motion, yet delicate enough to pick up fine details. Like Corona, Hexagon used film capsules that dropped back to Earth. Recovery was still done mid-air by specialized aircraft flying over the Pacific. It was a risky process, but most capsules were successfully caught or recovered after splashdown. Over time, the process became routine, at least for those in the know. To the outside world, nothing had changed. No one saw the satellites, the planes, or the vast quantities of film returning from orbit. To maintain secrecy, the US government used cover stories for these missions. Officially, they were part of weather or research programs. Some satellites were launched under the guise of testing Earth observation tools for geology or agriculture. Even people working in related fields often didn't know what the missions were really about. The facilities that developed the satellites, such as Lockheed's Skunk Works and Eastman Kodak, operated behind layers of classification. When Hexagon was finally declassified in 2011, the full scale of the project came into view. A satellite on display at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center outside Washington, D.C. shows the massive size and complexity of the system. But even now, many details remain classified. The exact resolution, the final missions, and the full capabilities of later variants are still unknown to the public. Some experts believe that versions of Hexagon were used well into the 1980s, possibly even later. Modern black programs, those still kept outside public view, build on the same ideas. High-altitude imaging, thermal sensors, radar systems that can see through clouds and at night, and signals interception are all part of the modern toolkit. Satellites today may no longer use film, but the drive to improve resolution, reduce detection, and increase coverage continues. Some systems use adaptive optics to sharpen images distorted by the atmosphere. Others fly in tandem, sharing data in real time. Yet for all the technical advancements, the heart of the mission remains the same: to understand what's happening beyond borders without crossing them, to watch silently from above, to see without being seen. At the Smithsonian, the Corona satellite on display looks like a relic from a different era, its metal shell polished, its camera system exposed. Visitors walk past it without realizing that it once changed the course of history. But what they see is only part of the story. The real innovations, the thermal controls, the film handling, the stabilization systems, are mostly hidden or still under wraps. The engineering that made it all possible is buried in archives, drawings, and the memories of those who worked under silent contracts. Hexagon's story, too, is only partly told. The satellite in the museum is missing key components, removed before display. No public model includes the full optical train or the actual flight film. What's left is a reminder that even now, much of the technology that shaped our modern intelligence world remains locked away. The USSR's cosmic spies, what the Cobalt and Yantar programs revealed. While the United States was quietly launching Corona and Hexagon into orbit, the Soviet Union was working just as hard to build its own eyes in the sky. The Soviets knew they needed to watch their adversaries from space, but they faced a different set of challenges. The USSR's space surveillance efforts didn't just mirror what the US was doing, they followed a different path, shaped by Soviet engineering, military doctrine, and political pressures. In the early years of the space race, the USSR focused more on high-altitude aircraft and ground-based intelligence. But by the late 1960s, the need for space-based imaging became impossible to ignore. The Americans had satellites photographing Soviet missile sites. The Soviet leadership knew it, and they needed to catch up fast. Two programs came to define the Soviet approach: Cobalt and Yantar. The Cobalt satellites were first launched in the early 1980s, though they were based on designs that had been in development since the 1970s. Their full name was Cobalt-M, and they were part of the larger Cometa and Zenit satellite family. These satellites didn't rely on digital transmission. Like the early American systems, Cobalt used physical film, spools of photographic material loaded into the satellite and returned to Earth in special re-entry capsules. Each Cobalt satellite carried one or more film canisters. After a set period, usually about 30 to 45 days, the satellite would eject the capsule and Soviet recovery teams would locate and retrieve it. Sometimes this meant searching vast forests or frozen terrain, often under tight security. The recovery process was treated like a military operation. Helicopters, radar teams, and trained search crews were all part of the effort. The quality of Cobalt's images was reportedly good, close to 1 meter resolution in some versions, and perhaps better in later upgrades. That was enough to identify buildings, vehicles, aircraft and track changes in construction patterns at military bases. These satellites helped identify missile placements, troop movements, naval deployments, and more. The information was filtered through the military intelligence services and often used to adjust Warsaw Pact strategies. Soviet engineers kept improving the system. Later versions of Cobalt had multiple film return capsules. Engineers also worked to reduce the time between image capture and recovery. The goal was to make the process more flexible and to get intelligence to commanders faster. Some versions reportedly included onboard film development systems to reduce the risk of image degradation. Others used newer materials to withstand radiation and temperature swings in orbit. But film couldn't be analysed in real time, and if a capsule was lost, so was the data. That's where the Yantar series came in. Yantar satellites were designed as the next step forward, launched as early as the 1970s and refined through the 1980s and 1990s. They aimed to solve some of Cobalt's weaknesses. Yantar was a more modular design, with detachable film capsules, better thermal control, and more stable orbital platforms. But perhaps its most important feature was its ability to stay in orbit for longer periods. Some missions lasted up to 120 days. Yantar was often equipped with side-looking optical systems that could sweep broad areas while still focusing on key targets. Some versions, such as the Yantar 4K2M, used telescopic lenses and large mirrors to increase image clarity. These systems borrowed ideas from astronomy and adapted them for military use. Soviet scientists worked in secret to build lenses that could resolve objects from over 200 kilometers away. Unlike earlier designs, Yantar satellites were meant to be reusable in a sense, not the entire spacecraft, but the data flow. By returning several capsules per mission, they could provide a steadier stream of images to Soviet analysts. There were multiple sub-variants of Yantar. Each served a slightly different purpose. Some focused on high-resolution imaging. Others were more tactical, giving regional commanders a clearer view of enemy positions. What tied them all together was the use of optical film and the slow shift toward real-time systems. By the 1990s, some models of Yantar reportedly included rudimentary digital links, early steps toward electronic transmission of images. But these systems were still in development when the Soviet Union collapsed. Both Cobalt and Yantar were part of a larger military ecosystem. Their data helped feed the General Staff's intelligence maps. They provided updates on NATO missile deployments, confirmed US submarine base construction, and even tracked nuclear tests in China. During the Soviet war in Afghanistan, some analysts believe reconnaissance satellites helped guide troop movements and confirm Mujahideen supply routes. The satellites weren't always fast, but they were steady. And for Soviet commanders used to planning operations weeks in advance, that was good enough. Not every capsule was recovered. Some fell into forests and burned up. Others were damaged during re-entry. But overall, the Soviet space reconnaissance system was reliable. Even after the Soviet collapse, Russia continued to launch updated versions of Cobalt and Yantar designs. These modern satellites, often called Cobalt-M or Persona, retain the same general layout: a main body for power and orientation, a camera module, and return capsules for film or data. Persona, which entered service in the 2010s, was a major step forward. It included digital imaging, allowing real-time transmission of data. But the overall layout, the large cylindrical body, the central camera, the orbiting pattern, still showed its heritage. Many Russian reconnaissance satellites today are believed to still follow the same design principles: large apertures, side-looking systems, long orbital durations. Some incorporate radar imaging, capable of seeing through clouds and darkness. Others focus on multispectral analysis. But the design DNA of Cobalt and Yantar is still there, hidden beneath layers of aluminum, electronics, and solar panels. Despite the secrecy and the limited technology of the time, Soviet engineers managed to field systems that were tough, reliable, and capable of gathering vital intelligence. Even as global politics shifted, the need to watch from above never went away. And so, the designs lived on, refined, upgraded, but always based on the foundations laid nearly 50 years ago. The US was quicker to adopt digital systems, to experiment with onboard processing and new launch vehicles. But the Soviet strategy, rooted in mechanical simplicity and rugged engineering, proved just as effective in its own way. China's leap into space surveillance, the emergence of the Yaogan fleet. In the early 2000s, a series of new Chinese satellites started appearing in orbit, launched one by one with little fanfare. There were no big announcements, no major policy papers or mission briefings, just a few lines on Chinese news outlets saying these satellites were for scientific research, land surveys, or disaster monitoring. But defense analysts around the world took notice. The names were all the same, Yaogan, followed by a number. And their flight paths, launch patterns, and payload designs began to tell a different story. Yaogan, which translates roughly to remote sensing, is a broad and vague term. On paper, it sounds harmless. But from the first satellite launched in 2006, experts suspected these systems were doing more than watching weather or measuring forests. They looked at the launch sites, military facilities like Taiyuan and Jiuquan. They tracked the orbital inclinations, which often matched those used by known reconnaissance satellites. And they noticed the instruments on board: synthetic aperture radar, optical cameras, infrared sensors. Bit by bit, a clearer picture emerged. China was quietly developing a full-scale space surveillance network. The Yaogan fleet grew fast. By the early 2010s, launches were happening every few months. Each time, China issued a short press release, always using the same vague language. There were no official photos of the satellites, no public data on their design, and no mention of military use. But patterns told their own story. Some satellites were placed in sun-synchronous orbits, ideal for capturing consistent lighting conditions for high-resolution imaging. Others were launched in groups of 3, forming triangular formations known to be used in ocean surveillance. This type of setup is helpful for locating ships at sea, using signals intelligence or radar reflections. Many of the early Yaogan satellites likely carried optical payloads similar to the older US KH series. This means high-powered telescopes capable of zooming in on land targets with great clarity. The resolution details remain classified, but analysts estimate they are capable of capturing images with better than 1 meter detail. Later Yaogan satellites included synthetic aperture radar systems. Unlike optical imaging, SR can see through clouds and at night. It works by sending radio waves to the ground and measuring how they bounce back, creating detailed black and white images of terrain and man-made objects. Radar systems like these are especially useful in regions with frequent cloud cover or heavy weather. Southeast Asia, parts of the Pacific, and even China's own southern coast fall into this category. SAR satellites allow for uninterrupted monitoring. If a carrier strike group moves through the South China Sea under cloud cover, a radar satellite can still spot it, and the data can be passed to military planners in near real time. The triple satellite launches, sometimes labelled as Yaogan 9, Yaogan 16, and others, introduced a different capability. These trios fly in coordinated orbits that suggest radio signal triangulation. In simple terms, they can listen to electronic signals coming from Earth, radio, radar, and possibly even encrypted military communications, and figure out where they're coming from. This is a core part of signals intelligence, or SIGINT. With 3 satellites working together, China could locate a ship's radar system anywhere in the Pacific. Unlike the US, where agencies like NASA and the NRO announce missions, sometimes even releasing photographs, China's space program operates under a veil of secrecy. There's no equivalent to the public transparency seen in US launch schedules. No interviews with satellite developers. No floor displays in museums. In fact, most images of Yaogan satellites are speculative, drawn by outside analysts using educated guesses based on rocket fairing shapes and telemetry data. Russia, even during the Soviet years, offered occasional glimpses into its space programs through public military parades or newspaper leaks. But China's approach has been even more locked down. Only a few amateur satellite watchers, often using nothing more than binoculars and orbital tracking software, have been able to piece together the puzzle. They follow the launches. They measure orbital decay. They estimate imaging windows. And what they've found points to one conclusion: China is building a reconnaissance network to rival that of any major space power. As of the mid-2020s, over 100 satellites have been launched under the Yaogan name. Not all are still in service, but many remain active. Their orbits crisscross key regions of the globe, overflying the Taiwan Strait, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and even parts of Central Asia. Some analysts believe that Yaogan satellites have directly supported Chinese military exercises, including missile tests and naval deployments. They likely played a role in tracking the movements of foreign warships near contested islands, and they may have even supported ground operations during border skirmishes with India. The growth of the Yaogan constellation fits into a larger shift in Chinese military planning. As the People's Liberation Army modernizes, it is moving toward what it calls informationalized warfare, the idea that data, not just weapons, wins wars. Real-time satellite intelligence is a core part of that idea. It means commanders can get satellite images of a target before they even arrive. It means ships at sea can avoid detection or track enemy movements. Unlike the early days of American and Soviet reconnaissance, China doesn't appear to be relying on film return systems. Instead, their satellites likely use full digital imaging. That means faster delivery of data and more flexible planning. It also suggests that China has built secure ground stations capable of receiving and processing large volumes of high-resolution imagery. These stations are scattered across mainland China, with additional facilities possibly located at overseas ports and friendly territories. The engineering behind Yaogan satellites remains classified, but outside observers have identified a few launch configurations. Some satellites appear to be built around a modular bus system, meaning components can be swapped depending on the mission. This approach allows for rapid upgrades and parallel development, similar to how the US uses commercial satellite buses for intelligence missions. Others suggest that Yaogan's SR satellites are closely related to civilian radar imaging platforms like the Garfin series. This dual-use approach makes it harder to separate civilian space efforts from military ones, giving China plausible deniability. The opacity of the Yaogan program creates challenges for international observers. Without open declarations, treaty oversight, or shared orbital data, other countries are left guessing about China's true capabilities. The satellites themselves are visible to anyone with a telescope. Their paths are predictable. But what they carry and how they're used remains a mystery. This lack of transparency runs counter to international norms developed during the Cold War, when the US and Soviet Union at least maintained a basic framework for avoiding misunderstandings. For instance, American satellites operated under publicly known orbits. Their launches were usually announced, and payloads, while classified, were often guessed with some accuracy by outside experts. Even Russian reconnaissance satellites often bore telltale signs of their purpose: repeat orbits over sensitive areas, or the use of specialized re-entry vehicles. China's satellites, by contrast, are cloaked in ambiguity. Their launch statements are generic. Their orbital adjustments are subtle, and their true intentions are rarely discussed, even in state media. Still, the message is clear. China has entered the top tier of space surveillance powers. The Yaogan fleet is a working, growing, and highly capable reconnaissance system. It supports military operations, it feeds national security planning, and it marks a new era in how space power is projected, not with bold claims, but with quiet orbits and persistent eyes in the sky. Beyond imagery, how SIGINT and ELINT satellites eavesdrop on the world. Intelligence doesn't just come from what's visible, a growing amount comes from what can be heard, and satellites, even without cameras, can listen. SIGINT is the gathering of information through the interception of signals, whether they're radio waves, radar beams, data bursts, or even microwave links. SIGINT is often divided into subcategories. One of them is ELINT, or electronic intelligence, which focuses on non-communication signals, things like radar pulses or telemetry. Another is COMINT, or communications intelligence, which focuses on voice, text, and digital data exchanged between people or machines. Unlike imaging satellites, which look downward through telescopes, SIGINT and ELINT satellites are tuned like giant antennas. They're designed to capture electromagnetic signals flowing through Earth's atmosphere. These satellites don't need clear skies, they don't rely on sunlight, and they can collect data over vast distances, often from targets far beyond the reach of cameras. Where an imaging satellite might catch a photo of a radar dish, a SIGINT satellite can tell you what frequency it's operating on, how often it's in use, what kind of modulation it uses, and how powerful the transmitter is. Orbit plays a big role in how these satellites work. Some are placed in low Earth orbit, or LEO, between about 300 and 1,200 kilometers above Earth. These satellites move quickly, circling the globe every 90 minutes or so. They offer short windows of coverage over any given spot, often just a few minutes, but can revisit frequently. LEO SIGINT satellites are useful for gathering tactical intelligence. They pass over enemy territory, scoop up radar signals, communication bursts, or telemetry from missile tests, and then pass that data to ground stations or relay satellites. But for broader coverage, many SIGINT platforms are placed in geosynchronous orbit, or GEO, about 36,000 kilometers up. From that altitude, a satellite matches Earth's rotation and stays fixed over one spot. This makes it perfect for continuous monitoring. A geosynchronous SIGINT satellite parked over the Middle East, for example, can listen 24 hours a day. These satellites tend to be large, with powerful antennas. Some may unfurl enormous dishes after launch, stretching tens of meters across. These dishes are designed to pick up even faint signals, whispers of activity from thousands of kilometers away. The US has operated geosynchronous SIGINT satellites since the 1970s, under programs like Rhyolite, then Aquacard, and later successors with names that remain classified. These systems often sit above hot zones, regions with military tension or unstable governments. From this high perch, a single satellite can intercept a wide array of signals, diplomatic communications between embassies, military radio networks, microwave relay towers, and even shortwave transmissions bouncing across continents. Each signal is a puzzle. Analysts study the waveform, strength, and timing to figure out where it came from and what it means. Low Earth SIGINT systems, meanwhile, can specialize. Some may focus on battlefield emitters, things like air defense radars or early warning systems. These radars turn on and off, change frequencies, and scan in specific patterns. A SIGINT satellite flying overhead can record those emissions, catalogue them, and even match them to known radar systems. This allows military planners to identify what kind of equipment a country has in place, how often it's used, and if new technology is being tested. When the Soviet Union tested new missiles, the telemetry, basically the data sent back by the rocket during flight, was often transmitted unencrypted. American satellites flying overhead could intercept that stream. It included engine temperatures, speed, altitude, guidance information, everything a missile engineer would want to know. This allowed the US to estimate how powerful a new weapon was, how accurate it might be, and whether it posed a new threat to American forces or allies. Today, the same principles apply, even as encryption and frequency hopping have made the job harder. SIGINT satellites are still tasked with catching glimpses of enemy command structures, missile ranges, and radar installations. In some cases, they even help track military exercises. If a ship begins broadcasting in a certain pattern or a radar station begins scanning in a new direction, it may signal that an operation is about to begin. When combined with imaging satellites, these insights become much more valuable. Let's say an imaging satellite takes a photo of a coastal base. It sees trucks, crates, maybe a few new radars installed. That's useful, but it raises further questions. Are the radars operational? Are they part of a training exercise or something more serious? This is where SIGINT fills the gaps. If an ELINT satellite also picks up new radar emissions from that same area, on frequencies not used before, analysts know the equipment is not just for show. It may be tracking aircraft or preparing for missile defense. Now, the image and the signal work together to give a fuller picture. Some reconnaissance missions involve multiple satellites working as a group. One may carry a high-resolution camera, while another carries a signal interceptor. They fly in formation, observing the same target from different angles, one with light, one with waves. This pairing allows for time-sensitive intelligence collection. If a country begins scrambling aircraft, turning on defense systems, and broadcasting orders, SIGINT satellites can detect the change in rhythm. Imaging satellites can then be redirected, either automatically or by command, to zoom in on the suspected area. Some countries, like Russia and China, are believed to have adopted similar methods. While fewer details are publicly known about their specific SIGINT satellites, their space forces have launched platforms into both LEO and GEO orbits that resemble early US systems. For example, China's Tianhui and Tongxin Jishuxian satellites show patterns consistent with ELINT collection. Russia's Lotos S and Pion NKS platforms are also believed to intercept radar and communication signals, and newer versions may feature onboard processing to sort through the vast data in real time. Processing is key. A single SIGINT satellite can collect millions of signals per pass. Most of these are noise, routine chatter, civilian broadcasts, harmless activity. The challenge is separating the signal from the noise. Ground stations often rely on artificial filtering, keyword recognition, and spectrum matching to sift through the data. Certain frequencies, for instance, are known to be used by specific aircraft or radar systems. Others might match previous bursts linked to submarine communications. Some satellites can even perform this filtering on board before sending a compressed, relevant data set down to Earth. Ground stations are limited by geography. Aircraft can only stay airborne for a few hours, but satellites orbit non-stop, covering entire hemispheres without crossing borders. They can track adversaries across oceans, through deserts, or deep within territory that would otherwise be impossible to monitor. And with every orbit, they collect more pieces of the puzzle: signal profiles, timing patterns, spectral fingerprints. As communication systems evolve, shifting to fiber optics, satellite phones, or encrypted bursts, so do the satellites meant to intercept them. New SIGINT platforms are equipped to scan wider frequency ranges, jump between bands, and detect fleeting transmissions that last only seconds. Some may even monitor commercial signals, as more militaries begin using civilian infrastructure to hide their operations. This blur between military and civilian signals adds complexity, but it also opens new doors for detection. Radar in the shadows, the disturbing precision of synthetic aperture. Satellites. SAR works by sending microwave pulses toward Earth. As these pulses strike objects, they reflect back toward the satellite's antenna. The time it takes for the waves to return tells how far away the object is. The strength of the return tells how reflective it is. And the phase, essentially the wave's fingerprint, can be used to detect even minute changes in position or shape over time. The synthetic part of the name refers to how the satellite simulates a very large antenna. In space, the radar platform moves along its orbit, and by combining echoes from multiple points in that movement, it builds an image with far greater detail than a single pass would allow. It's like painting a picture line by line, but with every stroke made of radar energy. The result is a high-resolution image, not in the visible spectrum, but one that outlines terrain, buildings, vehicles, and even disturbed soil. Military interest in SAR began during the Cold War. Clouds over Siberia were constant. Traditional spy satellites often returned nothing but grey, so engineers looked to radar. Early experiments proved SAR could spot airfields, missile sites, and surface changes even during bad weather. The technology matured quickly, and while optical satellites continued to improve, SAR became the quiet workhorse of persistent surveillance. Unlike optical images that rely on contrast and light, SAR maps shape and texture. It can tell if a field has been ploughed, if a runway has fresh tyre marks, or if a truck has moved. Military analysts use SAR to compare images taken days, hours, or even minutes apart. If something disappears, or if a shape shifts, they can see it. For instance, a convoy might leave an armoured depot at dawn, and by sunset, its absence shows up in a fresh SAR image, even if clouds hide the terrain from other sensors. One of SAR's most powerful tricks is coherence change detection. When two radar images are taken of the same area from the same angle, their waveforms can be compared. If the surface hasn't changed, the waves align closely. But if the ground has been disturbed, say by digging a tunnel, moving soil, or laying cables, the radar coherence breaks down. That's not something a regular camera would notice. But in SAR data, it's clear. A seemingly empty patch of Earth might show subtle disruptions, suggesting hidden activity beneath. This method has been used in real-world operations. In conflict zones, SAR images helped identify tunnel networks used by insurgent groups. Some of these tunnels were invisible from the air, hidden by foliage, rock, or sand. But radar saw the signs: altered soil patterns, slight subsidence, or irregular moisture readings. In other cases, SAR was used to track moving targets. Even if a tank is hidden under a camouflage net, its movement leaves behind soil compaction patterns or disrupted vegetation. SAR, especially in certain radar bands, can pick that up. With enough satellites in orbit, a given patch of ground can be scanned multiple times a day. And because SAR doesn't rely on daylight, those revisits aren't limited to clear noon shots. This makes it ideal for monitoring places where changes can happen quickly: ports, missile bases, or disputed borders. Commercial SAR systems have begun offering high-resolution data as well. Companies like Capella Space, ICYE, and Airbus now operate SAR satellites that provide radar imagery to customers ranging from governments to insurance firms. In natural disasters, SAR has proven vital. After hurricanes or earthquakes, cloud cover often obscures satellite views just when responders need them most. SAR cuts through that veil. It maps flood zones, collapsed buildings, and blocked roads even during heavy rain. One striking example came after a major cyclone in Southeast Asia. Optical satellites couldn't pierce the storm cover, but SAR satellites quickly mapped the extent of floodwaters. Emergency teams use those maps to prioritise rescue zones. In another case, SAR was used to track illegal mining in remote forested areas. Even when trees hid the operation from traditional cameras, SAR could detect the shifting terrain caused by digging and vehicle movement. Governments still guard their highest resolution SAR data, but analysts have pieced together the capabilities of various national systems. Germany's SAR Lupe, launched in the mid-2000s, provided the Bundeswehr with detailed radar imaging for reconnaissance. TerraSAR X and its successor systems continued the trend, offering sub-meter resolution and rapid revisit times. Russia's Condor series and China's Gaofen SR satellites also entered orbit with increasing precision and capacity. But perhaps the most secretive SR missions belong to the United States. While some platforms are acknowledged, like NASA's civilian radar missions, the highest resolution military SR satellites remain classified. Observers believe that the US National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO, operates advanced SAR satellites under various code names. These may have the ability to detect not only large-scale surface changes, but also movements as small as a few centimetres over time, useful for identifying underground structures or tracking stealth vehicles. In the intelligence world, SAR data often complements other sources. A SIGINT satellite might detect a spike in communications from a hidden base. A traditional optical satellite may find that recent images are obscured by weather. That's where SAR steps in. It can image the site regardless of weather conditions, confirm the presence of vehicles, or reveal recent earthworks. In coordinated operations, SAR satellites might be tasked within minutes of an alert, collecting data in near real time. SAR's versatility also extends into maritime operations. Radar satellites can scan oceans, spotting ships even when clouds obscure the surface. Since radar reflects strongly off metal hulls, SAR can detect vessels of all sizes, including those operating without transponders. This makes it valuable for tracking smuggling, piracy, and unauthorized fishing. In some cases, SAR has helped spot dark ships near disputed waters, ships that would otherwise vanish into the vastness of the sea. With advancements in machine learning, SAR imagery is now being processed faster and more effectively. Algorithms can detect anomalies, flag unexpected surface changes, or match radar signatures to known equipment types. A vehicle's shape, surface material, and even its movement patterns can all influence its radar return. Some advanced systems may now identify vehicle classes, trucks, tanks, trailers, based on these patterns alone. Their ability to see through walls of weather, over long distances, and with persistent detail makes them one of the most quietly powerful tools in the modern surveillance toolkit. Whether scanning mountains, cities, jungles, or oceans, they leave few places to hide. Hyperspectral surveillance, seeing what no human eye can detect. Where a regular satellite camera might record 3 to 7 bands of light, such as red, green, blue, and a few infrared slices, hyperspectral sensors collect data across dozens or even hundreds of narrow bands. Each band is only a few nanometers wide. Taken together, they produce a kind of light signature for every pixel in the image. Every material, whether it's paint, vegetation, concrete, or fuel, reflects light differently. The shape of that reflection across the spectrum acts like a fingerprint. This is the secret power of hyperspectral imaging. Instead of just showing that something is there, it can help reveal what that something is made of. That's why these sensors are prized in missions involving chemical detection, buried structures, camouflaged vehicles, or even early warning signs of hidden construction. Early development of hyperspectral sensors came out of research for agriculture and geology. Scientists wanted to know the health of crops, the makeup of soil, or the mineral content of rocks. They realized that light in the infrared range held clues that weren't obvious to the naked eye. A plant suffering from stress reflects infrared differently than a healthy one. Soil with traces of certain metals has a different signature than clean earth. These subtle differences could only be seen with fine-grained spectral data. It didn't take long before intelligence agencies became interested. Hyperspectral satellites could be used to spot hidden missile sites, detect chemical residues from fuel storage, or identify disturbed Earth long after digging had stopped. In one declassified example, hyperspectral data was used to find traces of oxidizer used in liquid missile fuel. The launch site had been covered up, the tanks removed, and the dirt levelled, but the chemical fingerprint in the soil remained. Hyperspectral imaging picked it up, even from orbit. Another strength of hyperspectral surveillance is camouflage detection. Military vehicles, when painted to match the surrounding terrain, can fool normal cameras. Even standard infrared sensors might be tricked if the camouflage matches the temperature background, but the paint or tarp used to hide a tank doesn't reflect light the same way as grass or trees. With enough spectral bands, a hyperspectral sensor can tell the difference. This capability has been used in areas where forces try to hide mobile launchers or armoured convoys under thick vegetation. In some cases, the sensors can spot build-up before it becomes visible. Say a remote desert area is suddenly showing new traces of ammonium nitrate in the soil. That's a key ingredient in explosives and some fertilizers. A hyperspectral satellite might detect the change, signalling that something unusual is happening. Combined with other data, it could suggest the start of weapons manufacturing or underground site preparation. Different oils, fuels, or chemicals spilled into the ocean each reflect light differently. A standard satellite might show a blurry patch on the water. Hyperspectral imaging can tell whether it's crude oil, diesel, or industrial waste, and even track where it's moving. In regions where ships are tracked for environmental violations, illegal dumping, or covert refueling, this kind of detection is invaluable. The raw data from hyperspectral imaging is immense. Each scene creates a cube of information, a stack of images, one for every spectral band. Processing this data takes special software and powerful computing. This is where spectral libraries come into play. These are large databases of known material signatures, everything from types of concrete, metals, and plastics, to specific fuels, explosives, and vegetation types. By comparing incoming data to these libraries, analysts can identify what's in the scene with surprising accuracy. Much of the early hyperspectral work was airborne. Planes carried the sensors on low passes, allowing very precise collection at the cost of limited range. In the 2000s, agencies began adapting these systems for space. The US is believed to have launched several hyperspectral platforms under classified programs. While many missions are still hidden, some civil and commercial sensors have provided glimpses of what's possible. For example, NASA's Hyperion sensor on the EO-1 satellite, though designed for Earth science, showed how space-based hyperspectral imaging could detect subtle mineral changes, plant stress, and pollution. The Department of Defense has not said much publicly about its own orbital hyperspectral platforms, but evidence suggests the existence of highly advanced systems. Rumours speak of sensors capable of identifying buried structures, detecting chemical warfare agents, or even tracking the construction of underground bunkers by the light signatures of the spoil piles. Some analysts believe that during tensions with North Korea, hyperspectral data was used to monitor facilities suspected of preparing missile launches or enriching uranium. The soil, air vents, or runoff from such sites can carry chemical clues that are visible to hyperspectral eyes. While thick clouds can interfere, many hyperspectral sensors operate in parts of the infrared range that can still return useful data through thin haze or partial cloud cover. In some cases, this allows collection where a purely visual sensor would fail. Because it's so rich, a hyperspectral archive becomes more valuable the more it's studied. Analysts can return to old data with new libraries or algorithms and pull out new insights. This retrospective power means that even routine-looking passes can reveal hidden activities later on. A stretch of road or desert scanned last year might only now show signs of a past operation, once the right spectral fingerprint is matched. China's Tianhui and Gaofen series include sensors that likely have hyperspectral capability. Some believe these are used to monitor foreign military bases, detect natural resource activities, or track environmental changes tied to defense infrastructure. Russia, with its strong legacy in earth science, likely applies similar techniques for military surveillance. The sensors are complex and expensive. Calibration must be precise, and the data volumes are huge, often exceeding what can easily be transmitted down to Earth in real time. Many platforms instead store and batch their data, processing it on the ground with specialized teams. But as computing power increases and satellite constellations grow, hyperspectral imaging is expected to become faster, cheaper, and more automated. X-37B and other silent orbiters. Some objects in Earth orbit launch, vanish into classified orbits, stay up for months or even years, then quietly return to Earth. No fanfare, no press releases showing off their achievements. They just land, get rolled into a hangar, and disappear again. The US Air Force's X-37B is the most prominent of these secretive space planes, and its missions have remained shrouded in silence since the first launch over a decade ago. It looks like a miniature version of the Space Shuttle, only about the size of a small bus. Officially called the Orbital Test Vehicle, the X-37B is an uncrewed, reusable spaceplane developed originally by NASA, then handed over to DARPA, and finally operated by the US Space Force and Air Force. Each mission is referred to only by a flight number, OTV-1, OTV-2, and so on. Every flight launches atop a rocket, usually an Atlas V or Falcon 9, and disappears into orbit without clear disclosure about its payload, its orbit, or its mission goals. It can stay in orbit for extremely long durations, over 900 days in one case. This endurance suggests advanced power systems, possibly high-efficiency solar arrays, or experimental battery systems. It glides back to Earth autonomously, landing on a runway like an airplane, which sets it apart from traditional satellites that either burn up or fall into the ocean. Military officials have described the X-37B's purpose in vague terms: testing reusable spacecraft systems, evaluating new sensors, and conducting long-duration technology experiments in space. But many analysts believe that this is only part of the story. Its cargo bay is about the size of a pickup truck bed. It can carry and deploy small satellites, or recover them. It could house surveillance instruments, maneuvering systems, or unknown classified hardware. Because it returns to Earth, whatever it carries can be inspected, swapped out, or upgraded. This flexibility makes it perfect for secret tests that would be impossible on a traditional, one-time use satellite. One of the most whispered about possibilities is on-orbit servicing. This means using the X-37B to approach other satellites, inspect them, or even tamper with them, swapping out parts, collecting data, or disabling components. These capabilities remain unconfirmed, but some close observers of satellite traffic have tracked unusual behaviors during X-37B missions. In one case, a small object was released from the spaceplane, then later appeared to rendezvous with another satellite. Whether it was simply a sensor test or something more advanced is still unknown. Russia, whose space program has long emphasized reusable systems in theory but struggled in practice, once proposed its own mini-shuttle, the Kuiper. It was supposed to launch like a rocket, fly like a plane, and be used for both crewed and uncrewed missions. But after years of development and shifting priorities, the Kuiper was shelved. Even so, Russia continues to show interest in reusable orbital vehicles. In recent years, they've hinted at projects involving recoverable satellite platforms and uncrewed maneuvering vehicles, though very little concrete information has been made public. China, meanwhile, has been quietly building its own answer to the X-37B. In 2020, they launched an experimental space plane that flew for a couple of days before returning to Earth. It was launched again in 2022, this time remaining in orbit for over 200 days. Very little has been officially confirmed, but Chinese state media said it was a step toward reusable orbital systems. Satellite trackers noted that it too released small objects during its mission. Traditional satellites are like light bulbs. You launch them, they work for a while, then they're done. But space planes are more like smartphones. You can load new apps, change the battery, and reuse the device. This makes them harder to monitor. For intelligence agencies trying to track space assets, a reusable platform like the X-37B breaks the familiar model of deployment, operation, and decay. A spaceplane could deploy decoys, small satellites that mimic others, or confuse tracking systems. It could carry a classified payload not declared to international space tracking registries. If needed, it could even alter another satellite's path subtly or interfere with ground communications in targeted ways. None of this has been proven, but the possibilities are often discussed in closed defense circles and academic papers on space strategy. The X-37B's long missions also allow for environmental endurance testing. This means exposing equipment to the harsh radiation and thermal cycles of space for extended periods to see how it holds up. This could involve next-generation sensors, shielding materials, or quantum communication gear. Because the craft returns, engineers can inspect the hardware afterward and make changes. It creates a feedback loop that accelerates development, something much harder to do with one-use satellites. The X-37B can land itself after hundreds of days in space without human control. This shows a high level of onboard intelligence, navigation systems, and mission adaptability. In the future, this could evolve into spacecraft that make real-time decisions in orbit without waiting for instructions from Earth. In a crisis, such platforms could act quickly, adjusting missions, changing orbits, or responding to threats before ground control even has time to react. This level of autonomy is also being explored by commercial firms, but in a very different context. Companies like SpaceX and Sierra Space are developing reusable cargo and crew vehicles for orbital transport. But the technologies, automated re-entry, in-space maneuvering, and robust thermal shielding are often dual use. The knowledge developed for bringing tourists or cargo to low Earth orbit can be applied just as easily to reconnaissance or military operations. This overlap is part of why mini-shuttles are such a sensitive subject. Other countries may soon follow. India has begun testing its own reusable launch vehicle, which might one day evolve into a spaceplane. Japan, with its history of advanced aerospace research, is also looking into small, reusable orbital vehicles. These platforms offer something that traditional satellites don't: adaptability. They can launch quickly, change roles, and come home to be rebuilt. In a world where technology changes fast and geopolitical events unfold suddenly, that kind of flexibility is powerful. So far, only a handful of spaceplane missions have been made public. Most of the X-37B's flights have launched under the shadow of secrecy. Occasionally, the Air Force will release a vague photo of it rolling down a runway, heat shield scorched, windows black, cargo bay closed. Then it disappears again, months, sometimes years, before emerging for its next flight. What did it carry? What did it do? Who was watching? Inside India's RISAT and EMISAT constellations. India has long projected its space program as peaceful, scientific, and focused on development. ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organisation built a global reputation with low-cost missions, including the famous Moon and Mars orbiters. These achievements were celebrated as proof that India could do big things in space without the massive budgets of the United States, Russia, or China. But underneath the science and diplomacy, there's another side of India's space program that has grown quietly in recent years. This is the realm of India's RISAT and MISAT satellites. RISAT stands for Radar Imaging Satellite and uses synthetic aperture radar. India's first radar satellite, RISAT-2, was launched in 2009, not on an Indian rocket, but aboard a different country's launcher. The satellite itself was rushed into service after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which exposed gaps in India's real-time surveillance capabilities. RISAT-2 was equipped with radar systems, and while officials said it would be used to monitor natural disasters, analysts quickly pointed out that the orbit it was placed in, known as a dawn-dusk sun-synchronous orbit, was ideal for imaging targets with consistent lighting conditions. It also passed over key border zones multiple times per day, including areas in Kashmir and the India-China frontier. Though never confirmed by the government, it became clear that the satellite had a strong military use. Over the next decade, India built up its radar imaging capabilities, this time using homegrown technology. RISAT-1, RISAT-2B and RISAT-2BR-1 followed, each more advanced than the last. These later satellites were launched aboard India's PSLV rocket, signalling a move toward full domestic control of both the satellite and its launch. That independence means India no longer needs to ask permission or rely on foreign timelines when it wants to put something sensitive into space. Each new RISAT satellite expanded India's coverage and image resolution. RISAT-2B, for example, can reportedly take high-resolution radar images of moving objects on the ground, even under thick cloud cover. It can monitor troop movements, detect changes in terrain and track ships. Some of the RISAT satellites are placed in orbits that revisit the same location every 24 hours, which makes them ideal for tracking changes over time. The official descriptions for these satellites still emphasize disaster response and resource monitoring, but their orbits, instruments, and mission behavior tell a more complex story. India doesn't announce when it starts using a satellite for military purposes. There are no public mission briefings or acknowledgements of strategic intent. Instead, what happens is silence, followed by changes in how military decisions are made on the ground. For example, after the launch of certain RISAT satellites, analysts noticed that the Indian military became more confident about cross-border operations. This includes airstrikes, surgical raids, and forward deployments in high-altitude regions like Ladakh. The quiet assumption is that space-based radar had given commanders better situational awareness. Launched in April 2019, MISAT marked a new step in India's space intelligence efforts. Unlike RISAT, MISAT focuses on SIGINT. These could be radar signals, radio chatter, or telemetry from enemy weapon systems. The satellite was launched into a special type of orbit that gives it frequent passes over both Pakistan and China. The mission was announced in vague terms, with ISRO saying it would study electromagnetic spectrum measurements. But again, independent trackers and defense analysts saw something else. The orbit MISAT was placed into gives it strong coverage of regions that are of strategic interest to India's military planners. Shortly after its launch, media outlets began to report, through unnamed sources, that MISAT was providing valuable intelligence data to India's armed forces. It could, for example, detect and locate radar stations on the ground, which is crucial during times of tension or when planning air operations. This kind of intelligence is exactly what's needed for suppressing enemy air defences or for targeting missile batteries. One important feature of EMISAT is that it was launched with multiple small satellites, some of which were placed into different orbits during the same mission. This demonstrates a level of launch precision and flexibility that India hadn't shown before. It also suggests that India is learning to deploy constellations, groups of satellites working together, to cover wider areas and share information in near real time. This trend mirrors what other space powers are doing. The United States and China are already building massive satellite constellations for both commercial and defense purposes. But while the US and China are looking at global coverage, deploying hundreds or even thousands of satellites, India's efforts remain regionally focused. The RISAT and EMISAT programs are aimed at maintaining superiority in the South Asian theatre. Their orbits, revisit times and target areas are carefully chosen to cover border regions with Pakistan, the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean. There's little interest, at least for now, in developing a global surveillance network or competing in every domain. This is strategic restraint shaped by limited budgets and clear priorities. At the same time, India is also experimenting with new capabilities that blend civil and military objectives. For example, some Earth observation satellites have dual-use potential. They can support crop mapping during peacetime and monitor enemy supply lines during conflict. This dual role provides political cover. It allows India to present its space program as peaceful, while still building tools for national defense. Another subtle tactic is the use of academic or commercial institutions as part of the satellite development process. Some of the payloads for RISAT and EMISAT missions are built with support from defense labs and universities. This spreads out the development across a wide base of expertise, but also helps hide the full scope of the project. A radar component built at an academic lab may be presented as a research tool, but once it's on orbit, its true function becomes clearer. India also benefits from the lack of open-source tracking of its satellite operations. While the US and Europe are subject to independent analysis from amateur astronomers and civilian satellite watchers, India's orbits are less scrutinized. This gives ISRO and the Ministry of Defense more freedom to experiment and deploy without widespread public attention. And in cases where foreign tracking agencies do observe suspicious activity, such as unusual orbital maneuvers or object releases, there's no obligation for India to explain. When RISAT or EMISAT launches are mentioned in the press, they're described in dry language: technology demonstrator, resource monitoring, scientific instruments. There's little detail on the actual sensors, resolution, or data sharing protocols. But the pattern is clear. Each launch adds a new layer to India's surveillance coverage. Each year brings better resolution, faster data links, and more frequent passes. Over time, these capabilities form a quiet net above South Asia. By building its own satellites and launch systems, India controls the entire chain of command, from design and development to orbit and data retrieval. There are no foreign suppliers who might withhold parts or data. There are no outside companies that could leak information. It is a closed loop, and that makes it hard to disrupt. France's Helios and Germany's SR Lupe. Europe's space-based systems aren't run by NATO or the European Union. They're owned by individual countries, mainly France and Germany, who have chosen to build their own capabilities rather than rely entirely on American satellite data. The result is a patchwork of systems like France's Helios and Germany's SR Lupe, serving national interests while sometimes feeding into broader European cooperation. These projects show how European countries have tried to balance sovereignty, alliance politics, and limited budgets in the quest for independent intelligence. The Helios program began in the 1990s with Helios 1A, an optical satellite launched in 1995. It was a response to the growing need for France to observe global developments without having to depend on satellite imagery from the United States. The Cold War had ended, but new crises, Balkans, Africa, the Middle East, showed that events could unfold quickly, sometimes without much warning. France wanted to be able to see what was happening on the ground, anywhere in the world, with its own eyes. Helios 1A and its successors carried visible and infrared sensors. Later models, like Helios 2A and 2B, improved the resolution, especially in the infrared range, allowing for better nighttime surveillance and detection of heat-emitting objects like engines or generators. France did not operate these satellites in complete isolation. From the beginning, the program included cooperation with other European nations. Spain, Belgium, Italy and Greece joined at various stages, not as full partners, but as contributing members. They paid into the program, and in return, they received a slice of the satellite's imaging time. This arrangement helped spread the cost of development and launch, which can be steep. But it also tied France into a web of agreements, some of which came with complications. Because multiple countries were involved, ground stations had to be distributed. Belgium, for example, hosts a key Helios ground station. Spain has another. These stations receive data from the satellites, store it, and pass it on to national users. This distributed architecture added resilience. If one station goes down, another can pick up the task. But it also raised questions about data handling and security. Not every country in the Helios network sees eye to eye on policy or military priorities. In practice, France has always remained the lead operator, and it retains control over the most sensitive data. But it still has to share, and in some cases, explain what its satellites are seeing. The shared nature of the Helios system also puts limits on how quickly it can evolve. Every upgrade, every new launch has to be negotiated. Funding depends on the budgets of multiple governments, which don't always align. When one country wants to push forward, another might want to slow down or divert funds elsewhere. These delays can cost valuable time in a field where rivals are moving fast. In parallel, Germany developed its own path. Rather than duplicating France's optical systems, Germany focused on radar. Germany's SR Lupe program was launched in the mid-2000s. It consists of 5 small satellites in low Earth orbit, each equipped with radar sensors. The satellites operate in a constellation. The development of SAR Lupe was driven by Germany's desire to maintain an independent eye on global affairs. Like France, Germany didn't want to rely solely on American data. SARLUPE gives Berlin its own radar snapshots of crisis zones, refugee movements, and military deployments. The satellites also support NATO missions and are sometimes used for disaster response, like tracking earthquake damage. Although Germany and France have cooperated on some fronts, their satellite programs remain separate. Data sharing agreements exist, but full integration has proven difficult. National priorities, budget timelines, and industrial policies don't always line up. Germany developed SAR Lupe mostly on its own, using German companies and maintaining control over operations. It was only later that the two countries tried to bring their systems closer together through frameworks like the MUSIS initiative, Multinational Space-Based Imaging System, but even that has been slow-moving. Beyond the military systems, there's also the civilian face of European Earth observation, the Copernicus program. Run by the European Space Agency, or ESA, and the European Commission, Copernicus is a constellation of satellites providing environmental data, tracking forest fires, climate changes, and ocean currents. The high-resolution data from Copernicus, especially from its Sentinel satellites, can have military applications. This dual-use tension runs quietly through much of Europe's space strategy. Countries like France and Germany often push for stronger military capabilities. Meanwhile, ESA focuses on peaceful uses, scientific research, and environmental monitoring. That gap creates friction, especially when countries want to repurpose ESA assets or request military-grade images from satellites built for civilian purposes. The rules about how Copernicus data can be used and by whom are still evolving. Some restrictions exist, but enforcement is difficult. At the same time, Europe's overall spending on space reconnaissance remains modest. Unlike the United States, which pours billions into its National Reconnaissance Office programs, European nations work within tighter limits. The result is a smaller number of satellites, slower upgrade cycles, and a reliance on cooperation. Some capabilities are simply out of reach without teaming up. That has led to attempts at forming shared European assets, programs where multiple countries invest together and everyone gets access. But these efforts often get bogged down in disagreements over who pays what, how much access each country gets, and who gets to decide tasking priorities. Still, the systems that do exist show that Europe has built real, functioning surveillance tools. They may not match the scale of American or Chinese programs, but they serve the needs of their users. In operations in Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans, both French and German satellites have proven their worth. They have guided military deployments, shaped foreign policy, and supported humanitarian missions. Germany is working on SARA, the successor to SR Lupe, which will bring faster data downlinks and improved resolution. France has plans to replace Helios with the CSO series, which will feature better optics and more agile platforms. These newer systems aim to close the gap with leading powers and to keep Europe competitive in the field of strategic intelligence. Dual-use dilemmas. When civilian satellites become military assets. Companies like Maxar Technologies, Planet Labs, Black Sky, and Airbus Defence and Space operate fleets of Earth observation satellites that were originally marketed for agricultural planning, infrastructure development, or natural disaster monitoring. These are legitimate uses. Farmers use them to monitor crop health. Insurance companies use them to assess post-storm damage. Environmental agencies track deforestation or melting ice. But the same satellites that map fields and coastlines can also spot tanks, air bases, missile silos, and mass graves. That dual-use reality is now well known. What's changed is who gets to see what and how quickly. In the past, only governments with dedicated spy satellites could get eyes on high-value locations in real time. Now, anyone with a credit card and the right political connections can order a satellite pass over a target. The data might not be as sharp as what government sensors capture, but it's often good enough. Maxar's Worldview series, for example, provides images with a resolution of about 30 centimeters per pixel. That's sharp enough to identify individual vehicles, tents, or damaged buildings. Planet's Dove satellites don't match that detail, but they offer much more frequent coverage, imaging the same spot several times per day. That persistent revisit rate is especially useful for spotting changes over time, watching as equipment moves, roads are built, or camps expand. During recent conflicts, this capability has reshaped how the world sees war. When Russia massed troops along Ukraine's border in early 2022, it wasn't just NATO satellites capturing images. Maxar and Planet provided near-daily updates to journalists, researchers, and foreign governments. As the invasion began, their imagery helped confirm airstrikes, track vehicle convoys, and even identify damage to civilian infrastructure. Because these images were public, or at least commercially available, they allowed open-source intelligence communities to flourish. Independent researchers and online sleuths, many with no ties to official intelligence agencies, began to sift through satellite data and match it with social media posts, flight records, and intercepted messages. Some of these groups, like Bellingcat, used imagery to investigate war crimes or track illicit arms shipments. Others built detailed battlefield maps, often faster than traditional news outlets or governments. This rise in open source intelligence, or OSINT, has created a new ecosystem of visibility. Small states that lack dedicated satellites can now buy access to strategic imagery. Non-government organisations, human rights monitors and academics can see into regions that once hid behind clouds of secrecy. But this shift has also made governments uneasy. Most countries still try to regulate how sensitive satellite data is shared. In the United States, export controls restrict how sharp commercially sold imagery can be. Under a system governed by NOAA and the Department of Commerce, companies like Maxar are required to downgrade imagery resolution when selling to certain clients or when photographing specific regions. For example, for many years, US regulations prohibited selling images sharper than 50 centimeters of certain countries due to national security concerns. That Kyle-Bingaman amendment created strange gaps in available data, but enforcement is complicated. European or Canadian firms like Airbus or MDA aren't bound by US rules. They can sometimes sell higher resolution data in regions where American companies face restrictions. On top of that, as more countries and companies launch their own imaging satellites, national controls become harder to enforce. A non-US firm with its own spacecraft might not be subject to the same export rule, allowing them to offer sharper imagery on the open market. This global competition has put pressure on regulators to loosen limits. US companies argue that if they aren't allowed to sell high-resolution data, customers will simply turn elsewhere. In response, NOAA has raised resolution thresholds several times over the past 2 decades, gradually allowing sharper images to be sold commercially. Today, many of the distinctions between military-grade and civilian imagery have faded, at least in terms of what's commercially available. The reality is that no matter how tight the rules, clever actors often find ways around them. A small country with limited resources might contract a commercial satellite provider to take images of a neighbouring military base, then quietly analyse the data through third-party labs. A group involved in a regional conflict might not buy imagery directly, but instead gain access through friendly states, academic partnerships, or sympathetic donors. In some cases, shell companies are used to mask the true end user. These workarounds raise questions that regulators are still trying to answer. What counts as military use? Who's responsible when commercial data ends up aiding armed groups? There's also the growing issue of licensing battles. Some countries are trying to tighten domestic laws to give governments more say in what commercial firms can image, when and how. Others are lobbying for global norms, perhaps through international agreements, to prevent destabilizing uses of satellite data. But getting countries to agree is tough. For some, transparency is a threat. For others, it's a tool. Meanwhile, some firms have begun to lean into the defense market. While their satellites may have been launched with civilian missions in mind, the revenue from military contracts is hard to ignore. Companies are offering direct tasking services, where a customer can request a satellite to take a picture at a specific time and place. These tasking windows can be sold at a premium, and many are now snapped up by defense ministries or intelligence agencies. This convergence has sparked new types of public-private partnerships. Western defense agencies increasingly use commercial providers to supplement their own coverage. In the United States, the National Reconnaissance Office has signed contracts with Maxar and Planet to integrate commercial imagery into national workflows. The data might come from a civilian satellite, but it now plays a role in classified planning. At the same time, watchdog groups worry about accountability. If a private company provides imagery that is then used for a military strike, who holds responsibility? If imagery enables surveillance of dissidents or political groups in repressive regimes, does the provider have a duty to intervene? These questions don't have easy answers, and as more satellites go up, the pressure to answer them grows. One thing is clear, the barrier to global surveillance has fallen. A few decades ago, only a handful of superpowers could image the Earth with any regularity. Today, even a mid-sized company can pay for satellite imagery that was once the exclusive domain of secret agencies. Some experts compare the shift to what happened with encryption or drone technology, tools that began in the military sphere but are now everywhere. As satellite imagery becomes more common, some countries are trying to shield sensitive sites. Camouflage, decoys, and timing operations at night used to be enough to hide from the eyes in the sky. But now, with radar satellites, infrared sensors, and constant revisits, it's much harder to stay hidden. Some militaries have responded by building underground or mobile infrastructure. Others have turned to deception, spreading fake information or staging misleading visuals to confuse both commercial satellites and OSINT researchers. Still, the genie is out of the bottle. Dual-use satellites are not going away. If anything, they are becoming more numerous, more capable, and more deeply integrated into how the world watches itself. The age of exclusive satellite espionage is fading. In its place is a complex, sometimes chaotic world where anyone, anywhere, might be looking down from above. MILSTAR, AEHF, and the DoD's Hardened Space Communication Backbone, the Military Strategic and Tactical Relay Program, known as MILSTAR, took shape during the Cold War. It was designed to offer secure, jam-resistant communications in case the worst ever happened. In that world of doomsday planning, no ordinary radio link would do. MILSTAR had to be hardened against nuclear effects like electromagnetic pulses. It had to be invisible to enemy interceptors. And it had to work under the assumption that satellites or ground stations might be destroyed mid-conflict. The first MILSTAR satellite launched in 1994, after years of development delays and shifting priorities. Each satellite was large and complex, built to survive and function for over a decade. What set MILSTAR apart wasn't just its security, but the way it operated. It used low data rates, which made the signals harder to jam and detect. Instead of blasting out wide beams, it used directional antennas to aim signals tightly, making them hard to spot from anywhere else, in space or on Earth. MILSTAR also introduced onboard signal processing. That meant a message sent to the satellite could be rerouted or delayed until it could be delivered safely. This store and forward approach was slow by modern standards. But in a wartime environment, especially one involving nuclear weapons, it gave commanders confidence that key messages wouldn't just vanish if one node went down. A total of 6 MILSTAR satellites were eventually launched. They were placed in geosynchronous orbit to provide constant coverage. These orbits allowed the satellites to serve large areas without needing a dense constellation, which was critical at a time when satellite costs were high and launch schedules were limited. But MILSTAR had limits. Its bandwidth was narrow, its speed was slow, measured in kilobits per second in some cases. As military data needs expanded, especially with the rise of digital targeting and real-time situational awareness, the system started to feel dated. A new generation was needed. That gave birth to the Advanced Extremely High Frequency, or AEHF, system. The AEHF satellites built on MILSTAR's core ideas but modernized them in every way. They were still hardened against nuclear effects. They still used protected waveforms designed to slip through hostile environments. But they carried much more capacity, supporting everything from voice calls to high-resolution maps and live video. AEHF used multiple narrow beams to reach individual users while also supporting nulling to cancel out interference from enemy jammers. That's the kind of adaptation that's become more critical in today's electronic warfare landscape. The AEHF system operates in the extremely high frequency band, between 30 and 300 GHz. This band is less crowded and supports narrow, secure beams. It's ideal for point-to-point links, where both sides can use advanced antennas. AHF uses several types of waveforms that have low probability of intercept and low probability of detection. That means enemy forces are less likely to even know a signal is there, much less break into it. This stealth aspect of communication is as important as stealth in aircraft. Another breakthrough in AEHF is cross-linking. AEHF satellites can talk to each other directly without needing to send everything back to Earth first. This reduces latency and avoids reliance on vulnerable ground stations. In a crisis where some parts of the globe might be under attack, this kind of mesh architecture becomes a lifeline. If one link breaks, the others can route around it. Messages can bounce from satellite to satellite, hopping across hemispheres without ever touching the ground, until they reach a secure terminal. AEHF has become the cornerstone of the US military's protected communications, used by the White House, nuclear forces, combatant commanders, and high-level tactical units. Each satellite covers a third of the Earth, and with 4 main operational ones, plus a couple of backups, the constellation has truly global reach. Some allied countries like the UK, Canada, the Netherlands, and Australia have terminals compatible with AEHF, allowing secure coalition operations. This capability is essential in the world of force projection. When a US Navy carrier strike group deploys across the Pacific, its coordination depends on protected links back to command. When a stealth bomber flies across the globe, its crew and mission planners rely on encrypted updates mid-flight. When missile submarines lurk silently beneath the sea, they still need a way to receive orders that can't be spoofed or delayed. AEHF provides that backbone. It also plays a central role in the continuity of nuclear command and control. In the event of a full-scale nuclear conflict, if parts of the command structure are wiped out, AEHF would help connect the surviving leadership with the forces still capable of responding. The system's resistance to jamming, its crosslinks, and its hardened payloads are all meant to keep the National Command Authority connected under the worst possible conditions. Early military satellites often relied on analog systems, wide beams, and unencrypted links. They could be jammed with brute force transmitters. They could be spoofed. In some cases, they could even be heard by commercial radio equipment if tuned just right. Milstar fixed many of these problems, but was slow and limited in number. AEHF solves even more, but also faces new threats. Today's adversaries don't just try to jam signals, they also look to blind, hack, or physically destroy the satellites themselves. That's why the AEHF architecture is designed to minimize dependency on any one node. If a ground station goes offline, other paths remain. If a satellite is blinded by a laser, others can route around it. The goal is resilience, not just in hardware, but in network design. The rise of anti-satellite weapons, including kinetic and directed energy attacks, has pushed the Pentagon to explore even more dispersed architectures. While AEHF is central now, future protected communication systems may involve more satellites in different orbits. Some in low Earth orbit for latency, others in highly elliptical paths for polar coverage. These newer systems might use optical links instead of radio, making them even harder to detect or jam. Protected military communications can no longer stand apart from the rest of the space architecture. They must interface with unclassified links, tactical radio systems, and even commercial networks. The US Space Force, along with its partners in the Air Force and other services, is now pushing toward a model where secure and insecure systems work side by side, each playing a role depending on mission needs. In an age of hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare, and AI-driven operations, it's still vital that commanders can talk. The message must get through, on time, to the right person and without interference. Whether it's a quiet ping from a submarine in the Arctic or a final command from a hardened bunker, the communication backbone must hold. AEHF is the thread tying it all together. The power of the X-band, How NATO commands from orbit. Satellites orbiting high above Earth form the backbone of NATO's command and coordination network. And at the heart of it all is a narrow slice of the electromagnetic spectrum known as the X-band. Operating between 8 and 12 GHz, this frequency range has become a key tool for secure, dependable military communications, especially when things get rough on the ground. X-band is not the only frequency range used in military communications, but it's uniquely suited to the demands of the battlefield. It balances three major concerns: bandwidth, weather resistance, and equipment size. High frequencies like Ka band from 26 to 40 GHz can carry more data, but they get scattered by rain or thick cloud cover. Lower bands like UHF or L band are more robust in bad weather, but can't handle complex data streams. X-band sits in a tactical sweet spot. It's not too high to be fragile in bad weather, and not too low to be too slow. It can push enough data for maps, drone video feeds, and targeting info while still punching through a storm or desert dust. A forward operating base under fire doesn't have the luxury of waiting for better weather to send coordinates. A naval task force can't afford to lose contact during a cyclone. And a NATO headquarters coordinating airstrikes or surveillance missions needs guarantees, not best effort links. That's where the X-band proves its worth. NATO's adoption of X-band goes back decades, built first around national efforts and eventually consolidated through shared systems. One of the central players in this space has been the United Kingdom through its Skynet satellite series. The name, while familiar to science fiction fans, represents one of the oldest and most advanced military satellite communication programs still running. The Skynet system began in the 1960s and has evolved through multiple generations. Skynet 5, launched between 2007 and 2012, marked a leap forward in capabilities and was specifically designed to support NATO operations. These satellites sit in GEO, giving constant coverage to Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa and Asia. This orbital choice is important because it allows for permanent links with stationary ground stations and roaming field units. Skynet 5's X-band transponders handle everything from encrypted voice to streaming video, with wide and narrow beams that can be adjusted in real time. The narrow beams allow for higher data rates and focused coverage, while the wide beams can serve entire regions. What sets Skynet apart is its mix of military robustness and commercial efficiency. The program is managed through a public-private partnership, allowing the UK Ministry of Defence to lease capacity while also providing services to NATO and allied countries. On the ground, the Skynet network connects to a series of hardened, distributed ground stations across NATO territory. Some of these are permanent installations in places like the UK, Germany, or Southern Europe. Others are mobile terminals that can be packed into armoured trucks, deployed by helicopter, or even carried in parts by troops. These terminals come in different sizes, from dish systems that can fit on a vehicle roof to larger setups that support high-volume data flows for command posts. One of the major advantages of the X-band is that it supports compact antennas without sacrificing performance. A 1.2 metre dish can provide solid throughput without the logistical burden of larger, more fragile equipment. This is especially useful for mobile ground forces or maritime units operating under tight space constraints. Aircraft and drones can also be fitted with X-band antennas, giving them secure links back to ground controllers, intelligence hubs, or other airborne platforms. Compared to Ku-band, which ranges from 12 to 18 GHz and is widely used in commercial satellite TV and some civilian-grade SATCOM services, X-band has better performance in challenging weather. Ku-band signals are more vulnerable to rain fade, which can lead to dropped connections or data loss in wet climates. That's a problem in tropical environments or during monsoon operations. K-band, while offering very high data rates, suffers even more from this issue. It requires precise beam pointing and tightly managed ground infrastructure to stay reliable. X-band doesn't offer the raw speed of K-band, but in real-world combat environments, reliability often wins out over maximum bandwidth. And when a satellite is supporting multiple users across a region, X-band's beam design allows the operator to manage resources in a flexible way. Bandwidth can be allocated based on priority, with high-value users like Special Forces teams or surveillance aircraft getting more, while others run on leaner profiles. While Skynet is a key player, other NATO countries also operate X-band systems or lease capacity from one another. For example, the US Wideband Global Satcom, or WGS system, includes X-band transponders and is interoperable with NATO partners. This shared infrastructure enables coalition forces to plug into a unified network, reducing duplication and ensuring that Allied troops can communicate securely and consistently, even if they're using equipment from different countries. Coordinating access to X-band transponders requires careful planning and diplomatic agreements. Countries with their own satellites may prioritize national missions, while others have to rely on shared slots. There's also growing concern about congestion. While X-band is largely reserved for military use, it's a finite resource, and the increasing number of users puts pressure on spectrum availability. Another concern is threat exposure. While X-band signals are less likely to be jammed or intercepted compared to civilian bands, they're not immune. Modern adversaries are investing heavily in electronic warfare capabilities. That includes satellite jammers, signal spoofers, and ground-based intercept tools. To counter this, NATO employs spread spectrum techniques, encryption, and frequency hopping. But staying ahead of the curve requires constant upgrades. What happens if one or more X-band satellites are targeted during a conflict? Could NATO maintain secure comms without access to Skynet or WGS? To address this, planners are looking at hybrid solutions, using a mix of X-band, K-band, and commercial services in a layered approach. This strategy helps avoid single points of failure and allows networks to adapt quickly under stress. Open source monitoring of satellite footprints and signal patterns has made it easier for researchers to understand how X-band systems are deployed. Using tools like satellite tracking software and spectrum analyzers, civilian groups can estimate where beams are pointed, how often they shift, and what types of activity are occurring. This transparency, while useful for accountability, also means that militaries must be more cautious about revealing their full network structure. In the years ahead, NATO will likely expand its X-band capabilities, both through new satellite launches and closer integration with Allied platforms. As space becomes more contested, the ability to command from orbit, not just observe, will be a deciding factor in who maintains control, even when the world below is uncertain. Laser links and optical terminals, a new age of satellite comms. Laser communications are not just fast, they are quiet. In the field of military intelligence and satellite reconnaissance, silence is golden. One of the biggest advantages of laser communication is that it doesn't broadcast in a way that can be easily intercepted. Traditional radio signals spread out as they travel. They're like someone shouting in a field. Even if the person is whispering, that sound can be picked up if you're standing nearby with the right equipment. Laser links, on the other hand, are like a focused beam of light pointed directly from one person to another. Unless you're standing exactly in the path of that light, you'll never even know the conversation is happening. The United States took a major step forward improving this technology with the Laser Communications Relay Demonstration, or LCRD. This satellite, launched by NASA, was designed to sit high above Earth and test optical links with both ground stations and other satellites. Its main job was to relay data using infrared lasers instead of the more common radio waves. Tests showed that the LCRD could transmit data at speeds of up to 1.2 gigabits per second, comparable to some of the fastest fibre optic links on Earth. But speed wasn't the only headline. Engineers found that the narrow beam made it incredibly hard to intercept or jam the signal, offering a new kind of secure pathway for future networks. The European Data Relay System, or EDRS, sometimes called the Space Data Highway, is designed to connect satellites in low Earth orbit to relay satellites higher up in geostationary orbit using laser links. This connection allows data gathered over remote or cloudy areas to be sent to ground stations in near real time, without waiting for the satellite to pass over a receiver. The EDRS satellites are equipped with optical terminals developed by Tesat Spacecom, and they've already demonstrated links of more than 1.8 gigabits per second. With these systems already in orbit, nations are starting to think about what it would mean to build entire command and control systems that lean on this kind of tech. A high-value drone patrolling contested airspace might beam intelligence straight to a satellite via laser. That satellite, in turn, might shoot the data across space to another platform orbiting over friendly territory, where it could be downloaded to a secure ground station. The whole process could take seconds, and if done right, not a single burst of radio frequency would be exposed to the enemy. Still, there are technical barriers. Laser links depend on a direct line of sight between the transmitter and the receiver. That works well between satellites, but becomes more difficult when trying to send data to the ground. Clouds can block the beam. Atmospheric particles like smoke or dust can scatter it. Turbulent air can distort it. All of this makes Earth-based laser comms more fragile than space-to-space links. To deal with that, engineers are experimenting with a few strategies. One is to build ground stations at high altitudes, such as mountaintops, where the air is thinner and clearer. Another is to install multiple ground receivers so that the system can switch to a clear one if weather becomes a problem at another site. Some teams are also using adaptive optics, systems that can tweak the shape of the beam in real time to compensate for distortions in the atmosphere. These laser beams are extremely narrow, sometimes just a few microradians wide. That means both ends of the link have to be precisely aligned. If the receiving terminal drifts slightly, or if the satellite moves unexpectedly, the beam can miss its target. To overcome this, modern optical terminals are equipped with fine pointing mechanisms, gyro stabilizers, and tracking software that constantly adjusts the aim. These tools are critical, especially in low Earth orbit, where satellites move fast and only have short windows to make a connection. Despite these issues, the benefits are becoming too big to ignore. The speed and stealth of laser comms offer something no other system can match. They don't rely on traditional spectrum bands, which are becoming increasingly crowded and contested. They're difficult to detect, making them ideal for covert operations or mission-critical data flows. And as more satellites are launched with optical terminals, the space network itself becomes more flexible. A constellation of satellites equipped with laser crosslinks could reroute data like a web, avoiding problem zones and ensuring delivery even if one node is taken offline. Newer military satellites, particularly in the United States, are being designed with these terminals from the start. The Space Development Agency's transport layer is a planned mesh network of satellites in low Earth orbit, many of which will use optical inter-satellite links to move data from point to point without touching the ground. The goal is a resilient, low-latency system that works even if parts of it are attacked or jammed. As optical systems mature, some defense planners imagine a future where a drone flying over a battlefield can send raw video data straight to a command center thousands of kilometers away without ever touching a radio. A satellite flying over a denied area can record activity, transmit the imagery to another bird over the horizon via laser, and then downlink it to analysts in real time, all without lighting up a single frequency that an enemy could track. But it won't replace everything. Radio will still have its place, especially for mobile units, wide area coverage, and redundancy. RF signals can reach around corners, pass through clouds, and penetrate buildings. Laser can't do that. So rather than replace radio, laser comms will most likely sit alongside it, forming part of a layered system that uses the best tool for each job. When high-speed secrecy is needed, the beam will take over. When broad coverage is more important, the dish will do the work. Commercial satellite providers are also starting to use laser links as a way to move data between satellites more quickly and reduce dependency on ground relays. This opens up new possibilities for global internet services, remote sensing, and more. But for now, it's the defense sector that is driving the push. Dead hand in orbit: how satellites may enable retaliatory strike systems. One of the most unsettling ideas in the history of nuclear deterrence was the concept of an automatic retaliatory strike system, one that could function even if its commanders were wiped out in a first wave. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union built just such a system, known in the West as dead hand, and officially referred to in Russian sources as perimeter. While many of the details remain classified for decades, the core idea was this: if nuclear attack indicators reached a certain threshold, sensed through a combination of seismic, atmospheric, and command layer cues, the system could launch a preset second strike, even if leadership was incapacitated. It was a backup plan for the end of the world. What once existed as a hardened underground network of sensors, communications nodes, and command bunkers is now taking on new shapes in the era of satellites and artificial intelligence. Today, defense theorists and space strategists quietly discuss what a 21st century version of perimeter might look like, and many of them look up when they do. In theory, space-based systems could detect launches, analyze missile trajectories, assess blast patterns, and transmit alerts, all without needing to depend on any one node on the ground. Combined with autonomous decision-making tools and fail-deadly logic, orbital systems might one day serve as the backbone of a semi-automated retaliation process. In this scenario, satellites would act as the early warning layer and possibly part of the decision loop itself. Infrared sensors aboard missile warning platforms like the US space-based infrared system or its successor could register the heat bloom of an ICBM launch within seconds. If enough launches were detected across different axes from multiple silos or submarines, the system could send alerts not just to command posts, but to AI-driven systems trained to identify attack profiles. In some concepts, they might initiate the next steps themselves, routing commands to hardened ground stations, spinning up retaliatory launch sequences, or waking up ballistic missile submarines on patrol. Most modern concepts still keep human control at the final stage, but in a high-tempo nuclear exchange, the minutes between decision and action are crucial. That's where the automation comes in. If a communications blackout hits leadership centers, or if an adversary launches a decapitation strike to kill senior officials, an orbital-linked system with pre-delegated authority might complete the loop, using a hardened constellation of space sensors, cross-linked terminals, and emergency transmitters to ensure a response, no matter what happens on Earth. The more one automates a response system, the greater the risk of miscalculation. False alarms have happened before. In 1983, Soviet early warning satellites misread sunlight reflections on clouds as incoming US missiles. A human officer, Stanislav Petrov, chose not to escalate. Had software been in his place, the world's history might be very different. That event is a cautionary tale, and one that still weighs heavily on policymakers. Still, as more countries develop hypersonic weapons and stealthy delivery platforms, the reaction window is shrinking. Space systems, by their very nature, offer the speed and coverage that ground sensors can't. A satellite can spot a launch over the Pacific, calculate its trajectory within seconds, and distribute that data globally. With the right links, that information can hit missile batteries, airborne command posts, and nuclear forces faster than any radio relay or telephone call. It's this capability that makes orbital integration into deterrence architecture so attractive and so dangerous. The US, at least publicly, has taken a cautious path. There's no confirmed doctrine that outlines a fully automated retaliatory system, and existing policy still places humans firmly in the chain of command. Safeguards include multiple confirmation layers, presidential authority, and hardened communication routes, like MILSTAR and AEHF. But analysts note the quiet shift. Missile warning systems are becoming more autonomous. Targeting data is shared faster than ever, and as AI tools grow in complexity, they are gradually being embedded into systems that once relied only on manual interpretation. Russia, for its part, maintains that some version of perimeter still exists, though its exact form is unclear. It may now rely partly on space-based assets. Russian missile warning satellites, like the newer Tundra series, are built to detect launches across multiple theaters and communicate that data through encrypted, redundant channels. Whether those satellites tie directly into automated retaliation logic is unknown, but their role in the early phases of a massive exchange seems all but certain. China's doctrine remains opaque. While Beijing officially maintains a no-first-use policy and emphasizes survivability through mobile missile units and hardened silos, recent developments suggest a growing focus on space-based sensors. China is investing heavily in missile warning constellations, possibly with US and Russian designs in mind. Some US intelligence assessments speculate that as China's space situational awareness improves, its capacity for quick launch decisions may shift accordingly. One major concern is that more automation increases the chance of systems spiraling without proper context. A satellite might register what it thinks is a launch. A low-orbit platform might misread a bright flare, or a cyber attack might corrupt its inputs. If its data feeds an AI designed to act quickly, the wrong signal could go a long way before anyone has time to stop it. For that reason, many defense officials stress the need for fail-safes, digital equivalents of keys, permissions and cross-checks that introduce deliberate delays or require human presence before a strike can proceed. If an orbital platform misfires, or worse, is compromised, it could act in unpredictable ways. Some planners have raised the alarm about the potential for orbital weapons platforms to be embedded with retaliatory codes, especially if these are tied to launch detection. That would create a situation where satellites are not just watching, but waiting. As launch costs drop and AI tools become more widely available, even smaller nations could try to develop autonomous deterrence frameworks, using a mix of commercial sensors and hardened decision software. That opens the door to strategic instability. A system might work perfectly in testing, but once in the fog of war, chaos rules. Machines don't experience fear or second thoughts. They do exactly what they're told, even if what they're told is based on a false premise. Faster sensors, global connectivity, encrypted laser links, machine speed decision systems. These technologies weren't available during the Cold War, but they are now. And as they converge, the question is no longer just whether we can build an orbital retaliatory system, it's whether we should. The 2019 NRO leak: How one image unraveled black budget capabilities. In August 2019, an unexpected tweet from President Donald Trump ignited a firestorm across defense and intelligence communities. The tweet showed an unusually crisp image of a launch pad, damage from a failed attempt to send a satellite into space. But it wasn't the subject of the image that stirred concern. It was the image itself. The level of detail was startling. Shadows from buildings were sharp. debris patterns were clear, and the photo's clarity far exceeded anything available from commercial providers like Maxar or Planet Labs. The apparent angle of the shot revealed that this wasn't an image taken from a spy plane or a drone. It came from space, from what experts quickly deduced was a high-resolution electro-optical satellite operated by the NRO. Within hours, satellite enthusiasts, defense analysts, and OSINT researchers around the world began tearing the image apart, pixel by pixel. They studied the shadows to estimate the time of day and satellite position. They measured objects on the launch pad to determine scale and pixel resolution. Through reverse analysis, some were able to approximate the satellite's orbital track. From a single frame, a stunning amount of information spilled out. Among the first conclusions, the image had a resolution better than 10 centimeters per pixel. That meant it could resolve details smaller than a basketball from hundreds of kilometers above the Earth. By contrast, the best commercial satellites at the time maxed out around 25 to 30 centimeters. This suggested that the US government had, for years, been operating optical payloads far more advanced than anyone outside the classified world suspected. While it was always assumed that US spy satellites outperformed commercial systems, the true gap in performance had remained hidden. The 2019 tweet, likely unintentional in its full impact, ripped back the curtain. Suddenly, the world had a clear, uncontestable data point. Technical experts deduced even more from the image's quality. To achieve that resolution, the satellite must have had a large primary mirror, likely well over 2 meters in diameter. That placed it in the same class as the Hubble Space Telescope, but pointed at Earth instead of the stars. Such a mirror, combined with a long focal length and advanced image stabilization, explained the clarity. Some speculated that the satellite in question was part of the KH-11 series, a long-running line of reconnaissance satellites developed in secret since the 1970s. More disturbing for insiders was what the image revealed about the NRO's internal handling of sensitive data. Traditionally, raw imagery from such satellites goes through rigorous compartmentalization. Analysts receive only what they need, often in redacted or cropped forms. Releasing a full-resolution image to the public, even inadvertently, was a breach of long-standing norms. The fact that it happened through a casual tweet amplified the fallout. Within the intelligence community, the reaction was swift. The Defense Department reportedly launched internal reviews. Analysts began reassessing classification protocols. Some pushed for tighter controls on imagery handling, while others argued it was time to rethink the secrecy altogether. After all, if a single photo could reveal so much, perhaps the whole classification model was overdue for reform. Outside the government, the image sparked a wave of research and renewed interest in satellite surveillance. Hobbyists and academics used it as a baseline, comparing it against commercial data and filling in the gaps of what was possible. Geospatial intelligence forums buzzed with activity. Conferences began featuring panels on the Trump tweet image, dissecting its significance. In a way, it became a Rosetta Stone for understanding the modern capabilities of reconnaissance systems. One of the most interesting aspects of the incident was how much could be deduced with no inside knowledge. Using only the image itself and publicly known details, enthusiasts were able to reconstruct a surprisingly complete picture of the platform behind the photo. This highlighted a paradox that haunts classified programs. The tighter you hold a secret, the more vulnerable it becomes when even a sliver escapes. Black budget programs, like those run by the NRO, depend on layers of silence. Not just technical secrecy, but operational, financial, and even linguistic. Official documents rarely mention them. Budgets are hidden in aggregate line items. Contractors operate under strict NDAs. But none of that matters if the product leaks out into the open. A single image, if sharp enough, can act like a pry bar. The political dimensions were equally complicated. The image, taken during a high-profile failure of another country's space program, was likely intended as a show of strength, but it backfired. Instead of simply embarrassing the other country, it drew attention to US capabilities. Foreign intelligence services likely studied it with as much interest as domestic analysts. In the shadow world of strategic deterrence, this was an unintended form of signaling, a card shown too early. It also raised legal and ethical questions. Satellite reconnaissance is allowed under international law, as long as it doesn't violate territorial airspace. But the image's detail approached the line where some might argue it infringes on privacy, sovereignty, or norms of conduct. While governments usually let sleeping dogs lie when it comes to satellite surveillance, the level of visibility demonstrated here could shift those attitudes over time. Back at home, the image also sparked public curiosity about what else might be hiding in classified databases. If a single satellite can produce pictures like this, what do analysts actually see? How often are these systems used in support of military or counter-terror operations? How many similar images have been archived, and who has access to them? With Google Earth, orbital tracking websites, and forums filled with sharp-eyed observers, even a classified image is no longer safe from scrutiny. What once would have remained buried in government files is now dissected in public threads within hours. That's the new reality for black programs. Their shadows are longer than before, but they're easier to follow too. All it takes is a single spark. And in August 2019, that spark was delivered. Snowden's orbital revelations. What we learned about satellite surveillance. When Edward Snowden released a trove of classified documents in 2013, the headlines focused on what most people could relate to: emails, phone calls, and internet activity being swept up by intelligence agencies. But buried deeper in the files were references to how space-based systems quietly supported a global surveillance architecture. These documents peeled back the cover on a system that relied not only on undersea cables and local telecom partnerships, but also on satellites, ground stations, and orbital relays. Among the programs exposed, PRISM became a household name. It referred to direct access, or something close to it, that the NSA had to the servers of major tech companies. But PRISM was just one spoke in a larger wheel. Other programs, with less catchy names, showed how satellite systems were deeply embedded in the flow of intercepted data. Programs like Fawnsat and Stormbrew didn't rely on tapping into corporate servers. They intercepted data in transit and then funneled it back to processing centers around the world. For years, the NSA had operated relay satellites in high orbit, positioned so they remained fixed over specific parts of the Earth. These platforms could collect data beamed up from remote terminals, on ships, in deserts, even from foreign embassies using satellite phones, and forward it silently to ground stations located in friendly territory. Snowden's documents confirmed that some of these stations were in places like Menwith Hill in the UK and Guam in the Pacific. These were hubs in a global network that relied heavily on the orbital layer to move information without touching cables that could be monitored or cut. The role of Guam was particularly telling. Out in the Western Pacific, this US territory is home to one of the most strategically placed satellite intercept facilities on the planet. Snowden's files revealed that the NSA used this location to downlink data from surveillance satellites targeting East Asia. Once the data was collected, it was relayed through secure fiber links or bounced again to other satellites, depending on where it needed to go. Guam's isolation was a feature. Its distance from most continental landmasses meant it offered a secure, low-risk platform for pulling in signals from wide swaths of the Pacific and Asia. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, British intelligence, specifically GCHQ, was engaged in its own satellite-enabled operations. What surprised many observers was not just the sophistication of the UK's capabilities, but the partnerships it had quietly formed with civilian satellite communications companies. One set of leaked slides referred to a program named TEMPORA. In broad terms, TEMPORA was a bulk interception project. It tapped into undersea cables, but also leveraged the cooperation of satellite communication providers to gather transmissions moving between ground stations and orbital assets. This cooperation often occurred under non-disclosure agreements or through intermediary contractors. In some cases, the companies didn't even know the full extent of what their technology was enabling. What mattered was access, specifically access to the right frequencies and timing windows that allowed GCHQ to capture high-value data moving between satellites and regional uplinks. Some transmissions were encrypted, others weren't. The point wasn't to filter at the point of collection, but to vacuum up as much as possible and sort it later. One revelation that caught many off guard was how the term third party was being used. For years, official documents from Western intelligence agencies used that phrase to describe cooperative countries outside of the main Five Eyes alliance: US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. To the public, it sounded benign, but Snowden's leaks showed that third-party status often meant those nations' data was being accessed or routed through partnerships without their citizens' knowledge. Countries like Germany, France, and Sweden appeared in files where their data flows intersected with satellite interception efforts. In some cases, national telecom companies had been approached under the guise of improving satellite services, only to find their infrastructure repurposed for collection. This reframing of what third-party collection meant caused a shift in how privacy advocates understood surveillance boundaries. If a person's communication happened to pass through a satellite link under observation, whether through a shipborne terminal, an oil rig's satellite broadband, or a commercial in-flight internet connection, their data might end up flagged, stored, and reviewed without their knowledge. Satellite networks had become a kind of invisible overlay to the internet, catching transmissions in places where fibre couldn't reach or where wireless was too insecure. But Snowden's documents showed how intelligence agencies were waiting at the edges of those networks, on the mountaintops, in remote islands, and at high-latitude relay bases, ready to pull in whatever floated past. Even mundane transmissions became valuable. A business traveller using a satellite phone in Africa might unknowingly route through a European or American satellite and downlink into a base station linked to GCHQ or the NSA. That call, even if it had nothing to do with espionage, could be stored for later pattern analysis. Metadata alone, who called whom, when and for how long, was often enough to trigger further interest. And because many of these communications weren't passing through US soil, they didn't always require the same legal thresholds that domestic surveillance did. These revelations challenged the public's assumptions about where privacy boundaries lay. Before Snowden, most people assumed that as long as their data stayed within national borders or used domestic service providers, it was relatively safe from foreign intelligence. The truth turned out to be far more complicated. A message could begin in one country, bounce through a satellite over the Indian Ocean, hit a relay station in Australia, and then head back down into Europe, all without the sender knowing. At each point, it could be collected, duplicated, and stored. One particularly telling phrase appeared in a leaked document describing NSA's global reach: collect it all. This was a strategic approach. Don't wait for a threat to reveal itself. Instead, build a storehouse of data so that when the time comes, you can look back and trace the path. Satellites, with their global reach and immunity to borders, made this approach possible, and the silence of space, the lack of visible infrastructure, the absence of obvious collection nodes, only made it harder to detect. Snowden showed that surveillance was happening everywhere through systems that didn't look like surveillance at all. Ground stations disguised as weather facilities, agreements labelled as telecommunications partnerships. Satellite constellations marketed as commercial or scientific, but fitted with piggyback payloads that served a second purpose. What emerged from the documents was a picture of a world wired not just by cables and routers, but by beams of light and radio whispering between spacecraft. Some of it was justified under national security. Some of it seemed driven by inertia, a bureaucracy that expanded its reach simply because it could. Either way, it brought to light that space had become a deeply integrated part of everyday surveillance. Private eyes, public secrets. How commercial satellites expose hidden military sites. In 2017, as tensions rose over Pyongyang's missile program, several news outlets published commercial satellite images showing new construction at missile test sites. They showed roads, buildings, even freshly poured concrete. Some showed missile launchers being moved into position. Others revealed cranes and scaffolding at what analysts believed were underground tunnel entrances. These images came from commercial providers like Planet and Maxar and were analysed by independent experts and NGOs. The imagery helped confirm that North Korea was preparing for new missile tests long before state media released photos. It gave the public a rare, real-time view into one of the most secretive countries on Earth. Another major turning point came in 2020, when Indian and Chinese troops clashed along the disputed border in the Himalayas. Official reports from both sides were vague. Each government downplayed the seriousness of the confrontation. But commercial satellite images told a different story. High-resolution photos from Maxar showed Chinese military positions being built up, including tents, vehicles, and fortifications along the line of actual control. India's own troop movements were visible as well. Analysts outside of government were able to compare photos taken days apart, tracking new structures, vehicle convoys, and even the appearance of new roads. That level of transparency had never existed before in a live border conflict between two nuclear-armed nations. In previous decades, these images would have stayed inside military planning rooms. Now, they were appearing in global newspapers and social media feeds. The idea that non-state actors, journalists, activists, think tanks, could monitor military buildups in near real time was something new. And it wasn't just being used for geopolitics. One of the most striking examples came not from a war zone, but from Xinjiang, China. In 2019 and 2020, several investigative reports used commercial satellite imagery to document the rapid expansion of detention centres in the region. Analysts at groups like the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and BuzzFeed News collected hundreds of satellite images, often from Planet Labs, to identify and track the construction of facilities where Uyghur Muslims were reportedly being detained. The photos showed the same pattern repeated across dozens of sites. Empty land in one image, followed weeks later by cleared ground, then construction equipment, then rows of identical buildings surrounded by fencing and watchtowers. Satellite images showed that some of the compounds had recreational areas, while others looked more like prisons. Analysts were able to verify locations using geospatial coordinates, road networks, and even shadows to estimate building heights. These visual investigations were often backed up by interviews and leaked documents. But it was the images, clear, time-stamped, and difficult to dispute, that gave the stories weight. They allowed the public to see what was happening, even if the governments involved denied it. Military planners had long relied on concealment, misdirection, and controlled access to protect sensitive sites. But commercial satellites introduced a new problem. They were always watching. And unlike government satellites, they didn't follow classified tasking schedules. Commercial constellations often took pictures of the entire Earth every day. Some, like Planet, even refreshed images multiple times per day. This constant visibility made traditional camouflage and deception harder. For example, In 2021, Black Sky published images showing new missile silo construction in China's Gansu province. Analysts had long suspected that China was expanding its nuclear forces, but these images were the first solid proof. They showed over 100 identical silo covers being built in a grid pattern across a desert plain. It marked the biggest known expansion of China's nuclear missile infrastructure in decades. And it was discovered not by a spy agency, but by an NGO using commercial images. In fact, it prefigured later US intelligence statements, which confirmed the expansion months after the imagery was already public. During Russia's military buildup before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, journalists and open-source analysts tracked Russian tank divisions, helicopter deployments, and logistics hubs using commercial satellite imagery. They were able to see new base camps being built near the border, long before Russia admitted any plans for invasion. Companies like Maxar and Planet began publishing images daily, often releasing them directly to the press. These images showed convoys of vehicles on highways, track changes to airfields, and even helped confirm that certain missile systems, like the Iskander short-range ballistic missile, had been deployed near Ukrainian territory. When the invasion began, commercial satellites helped track the infamous 40-mile Russian convoy heading toward Kyiv. Satellite images showed traffic jams, disabled vehicles, and fuel shortages. In one case, images showed how local resistance blew up bridges to slow the convoy. This democratization of space-based intelligence created new pressure on governments. When the public could see evidence for themselves, it became harder for officials to deny or delay responses. Even smaller countries began adjusting. In 2023, a country reportedly began building fake runways and decoy airfields, not just to fool military satellites, but to confuse commercial ones. Similarly, North Korea began constructing underground facilities with heavy camouflage to hide launch platforms and missile canisters from daily satellite overpasses. But even these efforts had limits. Capella Space, for example, launched a series of small SAR satellites. These radar images could reveal vehicles moving under camouflage nets or structures appearing overnight. The days when cloud cover could hide troop movements were over. In time, even the nature of warfare began to shift. Some rebel groups in conflict zones started using commercial imagery to plan their own actions. In some cases, humanitarian organizations used the same data to track refugee movements, damage to cities, or to verify war crimes. The line between military and civilian space assets had become blurred. What once required a billion-dollar satellite program was now available to journalists in war zones, researchers in universities, or even hobbyists online. Governments were no longer the only ones with eyes in the sky. And that shift was perhaps the most profound change in the world of reconnaissance since the first KH-11 ever clicked its shutter. Counterspace systems, the jammers, lasers, and blinders already in play. One of the most common forms of counterspace interference is radio frequency jamming. These are systems designed to block or scramble the signals that satellites use to talk to the ground, or that satellites use to talk to each other. Jammers can affect GPS signals, military communications, or satellite-based drone feeds. They don't need to be complex. In some cases, they are mounted on trucks or even aircraft. Sometimes all it takes is a strong enough signal sent at the right frequency. Russia has used these systems in several conflicts. During the Syrian civil war, reports began to emerge that Russian forces were jamming US military drones operating in the area. Pilots lost live video feeds or couldn't control their drones for periods of time. Some drones were forced to return early. Russia's Krasuka-4 system was often mentioned. Mounted on an 8-wheeled truck, the system could jam radar and communication signals over a wide area. Its effects were temporary, but in a fast-moving battlefield, even a few minutes of confusion can shift the outcome. In Ukraine, similar systems were put into action. Russian forces reportedly deployed GPS jammers to confuse Ukrainian artillery systems that relied on satellite-based targeting. Some Ukrainian units reported that their smart munitions missed their targets or stopped working altogether. In return, Ukraine began using smaller drone jammers of their own, disrupting Russian surveillance systems. The fight for the electromagnetic spectrum became a war within a war. Unlike missiles or bombs, jammers don't leave physical damage. Once the system is turned off, satellite functions often return to normal. That makes them especially useful for hybrid warfare, where countries try to apply pressure without starting an open war. A country can deny involvement in a jamming incident or claim it was a technical malfunction. There's rarely any hard proof. But jammers are just one tool. Another is laser dazzling. These systems are designed to temporarily blind a satellite's optical sensors. Instead of jamming radio waves, dazzling systems point a powerful beam of light, usually from the ground, at a satellite's camera. The effect is like shining a flashlight into a security camera. The image gets washed out, and the satellite either sees nothing or sees false information. Dazzling can be temporary or damaging, depending on the intensity and duration of the laser. If used carefully, it can blind a satellite for a few seconds or minutes, just enough to hide a sensitive activity, like moving military equipment or launching a missile. If used recklessly or with enough power, the laser can burn or destroy the satellite's optical sensors, leaving lasting damage. China is believed to have developed several ground-based laser systems for this purpose. In 2006, US officials revealed that a Chinese laser had targeted a US spy satellite. The laser didn't damage the satellite, but it showed that China had the ability to track and illuminate satellites in low Earth orbit. Later, satellite images showed suspected laser bases in China's Xinjiang and Sichuan provinces, often co-located with telescopes or other tracking systems. The US and Russia also have laser programs, though details remain classified. There have been rumors of airborne laser platforms, truck-mounted lasers, and even space-based systems. These programs are often framed as being for missile defense, but the technology overlaps heavily with anti-satellite operations. While lasers can affect optical satellites, radar satellites pose a harder challenge. To interfere with radar satellites, countries have started looking into electronic warfare systems that target the radar frequencies themselves, either by jamming them or by sending false returns. These techniques are sometimes called spoofing. The goal is to confuse the satellite, making it see things that aren't there or hiding things that are. Spoofing doesn't need to break the satellite, just fool it long enough for the military on the ground to act without being watched. Alongside jamming and dazzling, there are more aggressive tools. Some are designed to disable or destroy satellites entirely. These include kinetic kill vehicles, like anti-satellite missiles, which physically hit a satellite and break it into pieces. But these attacks come with major risks. Destroying a satellite in orbit creates debris, which can threaten other satellites or even crewed space missions. After China tested an anti-satellite missile in 2007, the resulting cloud of debris took years to clean up, and some pieces are still up there. Because of the danger, countries have turned to less visible methods. For example, Russia has launched several satellites that appear to shadow other satellites in orbit. In some cases, they have approached closely, raising concerns that they could be used to interfere with or damage foreign satellites. These so-called inspector satellites could carry robotic arms or directed energy systems. They don't destroy on contact, but they might disrupt or disable a satellite's solar panels, antennas, or sensors. Outer space is governed by the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which bans weapons of mass destruction in orbit, but says little about jammers, lasers, or spoofers. The treaty also says space should be used for peaceful purposes, but many nations argue that defending one's satellites is part of maintaining peace. There's also the question of sovereignty. In airspace, flying over another country without permission is seen as a violation, but space is shared. Satellites from different countries fly over each other constantly. What happens when one country interferes with another's satellite from its own soil? Is that an act of war? A technical error? A legal grey area? Military planners have started dividing space attacks into two broad categories: reversible and irreversible. Reversible attacks include jamming, spoofing, and dazzling. These cause disruption, but usually don't lead to lasting harm. The effects can be undone once the attack stops. Irreversible attacks, on the other hand, include missile strikes, powerful lasers, or even high-speed collisions. These destroy or permanently damage the target. Because of the risks involved, most countries prefer reversible methods. They allow for deniability. They can be used as warnings or to gain small advantages without escalating to full conflict. But the line is thin. A jammer that lasts too long or a laser that burns too bright could easily be seen as crossing a threshold. In recent years, the number of reported counterspace incidents has grown. US military commanders have said that they are under attack every day in space, not by missiles, but by constant electronic interference. NATO has begun to include space as an operational domain, alongside land, sea, air, and cyber. And space-focused military branches, like the US Space Force, are now tasked with both defending satellites and preparing to respond if those satellites are threatened. Countries are investing more in satellite hardening, building systems that can resist jamming, dodge laser attacks, or detect when they are being spoofed. Some satellites are getting smarter software that can filter out noise or switch frequencies on the fly. Others are being paired with smaller backup satellites that can take over if the main system fails. The arms race in space is well underway. ASAT weapons and the kinetic kill nightmare. In the early hours of a cold January night in 2007, China launched a missile from the Xichang Satellite Launch Center in Sichuan Province. The target was a defunct Chinese weather satellite called Fengyun 1C orbiting 865 kilometers above the planet. The missile traveled upward into space and slammed into the satellite, destroying it in an instant. What followed was chaos. The impact scattered thousands of pieces of debris into orbit. Many of those fragments were too small to track, but large enough to damage or destroy other satellites. Almost immediately, tracking stations around the world picked up a spike in new space objects. The US military, which monitors orbital debris, added over 3,000 catalogued fragments to its database. It was the worst space debris event in history. Years later, some of those pieces are still up there, racing around the planet at over 7 kilometers per second. This was not the first test of an anti-satellite weapon, or ASAT, but it marked a new phase in how countries viewed space conflict. ASAT weapons fall into two broad categories. The first is direct ascent, where a missile is launched from the ground and flies into space to strike a satellite. The second is co-orbital, where a satellite already in space maneuvers into position to attack another. The United States was the first to develop and test direct ascent ASATs during the Cold War. In the 1950s and 1960s, these tests were basic. Some involved nuclear warheads detonated in space. One such test, Starfish Prime in 1962, created an electromagnetic pulse that knocked out satellites and caused auroras seen in the Pacific. It also generated a cloud of charged particles that damaged other spacecraft, including some belonging to the US. Later, the US focused on more surgical methods. In the 1980s, it tested air-launched ASAT missiles from fighter jets. A famous test in 1985 saw a US F-15 jet shoot down an American satellite called Solwand P-78-1 using a missile with a kinetic kill vehicle. That is, it used sheer speed and impact to destroy the satellite without any explosives. The missile launched into low Earth orbit and hit its target directly, reducing it to fragments. The test was successful, but the debris it created was a warning. After that, ASAT tests slowed. Treaties, public backlash, and changing priorities made open space destruction less attractive, but the capability never fully went away. In 2008, the US again used a direct ascent missile to shoot down a satellite. This time, it was a failing spy satellite, USA 193, that had lost control and was falling toward Earth. Officials said the satellite carried toxic fuel, and destroying it at a low altitude would prevent harm. The missile used was a modified SM-3 launched from the USS Lake Erie, a Navy cruiser. It hit the satellite successfully at an altitude of about 240 kilometers, much lower than the Chinese test. The US emphasized that the operation was not a weapons test, but the timing and precision raised eyebrows. Some observers saw it as a demonstration of power, particularly in response to the 2007 Chinese strike. Russia too has maintained ASAT capabilities. In 2021, it conducted a direct ascent test that destroyed one of its own satellites, Cosmos 1408, using a Nudol missile. The explosion created more than 1,500 trackable fragments, again adding to the cloud of debris that threatened spacecraft in low orbit. The International Space Station, which shares similar altitudes, was forced to perform maneuvers to avoid possible collisions. Astronauts on board even had to take shelter in escape vehicles. It was a stark reminder that ASAT tests put every satellite operator at risk. India joined the club in 2019 with its Mission Shakti test. It launched a missile to destroy an Indian satellite, Microsat-R, at an altitude of around 300 kilometers. India claimed the test was responsible and would not create long-lasting debris. While the altitude was low enough that most fragments would re-enter the atmosphere within weeks, some lingered longer than expected. Critics warned that even temporary debris fields can damage space assets. Supporters argued that India needed to demonstrate this capability to show it could defend its space assets if needed. All of these direct ascent ASAT are fast, relatively simple weapons in concept, but they are also blunt tools. Their main drawback is the debris they create. Every destroyed satellite sends clouds of high-speed fragments flying in all directions. These fragments can stay in orbit for years, threatening spacecraft that have nothing to do with the original conflict. That's one reason some countries have turned to co-orbital approaches. In a co-orbital ASAT system, a satellite is launched into space and slowly moves into position over days or weeks. Once close to the target, it might jam communications, blind sensors, or physically interfere. It could also carry a kinetic kill vehicle that detaches and strikes the target. Because co-orbital systems can be more targeted and less destructive, they are seen as cleaner, but they also take more time and are easier to detect. A direct ascent strike is fast. It can take out a satellite within minutes of launch. That makes it ideal for emergencies or surprises. A co-orbital strike is slower but offers more flexibility. It can hover near the target, wait for the right time, or apply pressure without pulling the trigger. The Outer Space Treaty bans weapons of mass destruction in space, but it does not explicitly forbid conventional weapons or ASAT tests. That leaves room for countries to argue their actions are defensive or experimental. But as space becomes more crowded and valuable, the risks of an incident grow. So far, we have steered clear of the Kessler syndrome, but with each new ASAT test, the risk gets closer. The 2007 Chinese test remains the single worst contributor to debris in orbit. The 2021 Russian test added another large batch. Future tests, especially at higher altitudes, could create debris that lasts for decades or even centuries. The nightmare scenario is still a kinetic war in space, a conflict where multiple satellites are destroyed and debris fills critical orbits. In that environment, even nations not involved in the conflict would suffer. Communication networks would go down. Weather monitoring could be disrupted. GPS signals might fail. It wouldn't just be a military loss, it would be a global one. Space-to-Earth energy weapons, still fiction or quietly real? The idea of a weapon in space that can fire a beam down to Earth has been around for decades. In movies, it's usually a bright column of energy slicing through the sky. But in real life, the conversation is less dramatic and buried in government documents, technical journals, and defense budgets. The first serious look at space-to-Earth directed energy weapons came during the Cold War. The US Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, explored various futuristic systems to defend against Soviet missiles. Some of those ideas included satellites that could fire lasers or particle beams from orbit, aiming at targets in space or possibly on the ground. These were never built, but the research laid the groundwork for what would follow. Among the most discussed concepts is the orbiting laser. A high-powered chemical or solid-state laser mounted on a satellite could, in theory, fire a focused beam of energy at a ground target. If the beam had enough power and stayed on target long enough, it could damage or destroy vehicles, radar stations, or even aircraft on the ground. But there are problems, big ones. First, there's the power issue. A laser strong enough to do real damage from orbit would need an enormous amount of energy. That means the satellite would either have to carry huge solar arrays or rely on a nuclear power source, both of which bring their own risks. Large solar arrays take up space, can be fragile, and make the satellite easy to track. Nuclear sources bring safety concerns and legal restrictions, especially since many treaties limit nuclear devices in space. Second, there's heat. Lasers convert electrical energy into light, but they're not very efficient. A lot of the energy turns into heat, and in space, getting rid of heat isn't easy. There's no air to carry it away. Instead, the satellite would have to radiate the heat out into space, which takes time and big radiators. That makes the platform heavier, slower to fire again, and easier to detect. Third, there's the beam itself. Keeping a laser beam focused over hundreds or even thousands of kilometers isn't simple. The beam can spread out, lose intensity, or get bent by the atmosphere as it enters Earth's sky. Atmospheric distortion, clouds, dust, and even humidity can all reduce the laser's effectiveness. Adaptive optics can help, but they add complexity and still can't overcome all the problems. In the early 2000s, the US military funded programs to explore space-based directed energy systems. Some of the research was open, some was not. Patents were filed for systems that could fire microwave or laser beams from high-altitude platforms. In one case, Boeing worked on the airborne laser, a plane with a chemical laser mounted in its nose intended to shoot down missiles during their launch phase. The concept didn't reach full deployment, but parts of the program were folded into other classified projects. Unlike lasers, which deliver focused light, microwaves deliver focused radio frequency energy. A space-based microwave weapon would emit high-powered pulses aimed at disrupting electronics on the ground. In theory, it wouldn't destroy buildings or vehicles, but it could fry radars, disable communication systems, or knock out computer networks. Because microwave beams are less affected by weather, they're sometimes seen as more reliable. Several reports suggest that both the US and China have experimented with high-altitude or near-space microwave weapons. Some documents describe concepts where a satellite, or even a high-altitude balloon, could carry a device capable of targeting wide areas with bursts of energy. These wouldn't be pinpoint strikes like a laser, but more like an electromagnetic blast over a city or base. Again, the big issue is power. Generating the energy needed to make such a system effective would still require very large solar panels or onboard fuel. One of the most public hints that space-based directed energy weapons are being seriously explored came in 2019, when the US Space Force began talking openly about counter-space operations. While much of their mission focuses on protecting satellites from attack, some officials hinted at offensive capabilities as well. Declassified budget documents showed funding set aside for exotic power systems and non-kinetic counterspace operations. Several of China's academic and military institutions have published papers on laser weapon systems, including ground-based lasers aimed at low Earth orbit targets. Some reports suggest China is developing space-based platforms that could one day carry such systems, although most of the information is speculative or based on open-source intelligence. Some of the public interest in these systems comes from the way they've been portrayed in fiction. Films, books, and video games often imagine powerful orbital lasers that can strike targets instantly and without warning. These images influence public perception and sometimes shape policy discussions, especially when fictional systems are taken as technically plausible. But in reality, the systems being explored today are far more limited. They're unlikely to destroy entire buildings or vaporize tanks. The focus is more on disruption, burning out sensors, damaging electronics, or degrading communications. Still, even that can be powerful. In a world where so much depends on electronic systems, being able to disable a radar station or blind a sensor network could change the outcome of a conflict. Space-to-Earth energy weapons may not be the giant death rays of fiction, but they're not entirely fantasy either. The technology exists in pieces: powerful lasers, microwave emitters, precision optics, orbital platforms. The challenge is putting them together in a way that works reliably and safely, and doing it without starting a global arms race. Orbital EMP platforms, a nuclear threat no one talks about. In 1962, during a US test called Starfish Prime, a 1.4 megaton nuclear bomb was detonated 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. It was meant to test the effects of a high-altitude nuclear explosion. The explosion knocked out streetlights and damaged electronics in Hawaii, nearly 900 miles away. It also disabled several satellites in orbit, including some of the US's own. The pulse spread across a huge area and showed just how vulnerable the planet's electrical systems could be to a blast in space. That test, and others, sparked intense military interest in electromagnetic pulse weapons or EMPs. Could you create an EMP without the nuclear part? Could you generate a massive pulse of electromagnetic energy, enough to disrupt electronics over a wide area, using conventional technology? The answer, at least in theory, is yes. Non-nuclear EMPs, sometimes called E-bombs, or directed energy radio frequency weapons, use rapid releases of electrical energy, sometimes with explosive power sources, to generate intense bursts of electromagnetic radiation. On a small scale, these can fry circuit boards, disable vehicles, or take out radar installations. Some military systems already exist in this category. The US Air Force, for example, has tested cruise missiles equipped with high-power microwave generators, designed to fly over a city and knock out electronics without causing physical destruction. Scaling this up to the orbital level, however, presents a different set of challenges. For a space-based EMP weapon to be effective across a large area on Earth, it would need to be placed in low Earth orbit, fired at just the right moment, and pack enough power to affect electronics through the atmosphere. Power generation, beam shaping, and aiming all become complex problems. But in principle, it's possible. A satellite carrying a compact explosive-driven flux compression generator, for example, could produce a powerful EMP burst without involving any nuclear reaction. Even if such a device wouldn't be as powerful as a nuclear detonation, it wouldn't have to be. With modern electronics becoming smaller, more sensitive, and more essential to everything from power grids to defence systems. Even a moderate electromagnetic disturbance could cause widespread disruption. That's especially true if the pulse was directed, targeted at a specific region, or synchronized with other types of attacks. A non-nuclear EMP weapon wouldn't cause direct casualties, and it wouldn't leave radiation or fallout. But if used in orbit, it could still trigger a major international crisis. It would represent a weapon deployed in space for use against targets on Earth. The source of the pulse would be hard to hide. Once fired, the satellite would likely be identified, targeted, or even destroyed. And the political fallout could be severe, especially if the pulse hits civilian systems like hospitals, water treatment plants, or financial networks. In the eyes of many countries, that would still qualify as an act of war. If one country used a space-based EMP weapon, others might follow. Some might retaliate with cyber attacks, others with their own space systems. What begins as a clean strike could quickly spiral into broader conflict, especially in a world where satellites are key to navigation, communication, and early warning. For now, the evidence that space-based non-nuclear EMP platforms are operational is limited. Most of the available information comes from research papers, patents, and budget documents. Some military officials have hinted at non-kinetic options for space-based warfare, but without naming specifics. Intelligence agencies around the world likely track these developments closely, but the public record remains sparse. A sky full of spies. Can humanity ever escape the gaze of machine eyes? Every time satellite technology has taken a leap forward, questions about its use have followed. During the Cold War, the first spy satellites like Corona showed that it was possible to image cities, factories, and missile fields from hundreds of kilometres above Earth. This changed the nature of arms control, because it became hard for nations to hide strategic secrets. In the years that followed, commercial satellite imagery grew more accessible. First it was used by scientists, then journalists, then regular citizens. The tools that once required billion-dollar investments in aerospace programs could suddenly be rented for the price of a few licenses. Now the gap between government and commercial surveillance is shrinking. Synthetic aperture radar systems can see through clouds and darkness. Infrared sensors can detect body heat, vehicle movement, or even the cooling patterns of recently used electronics. Machine learning makes it easier to process thousands of satellite passes per day and identify subtle changes in everything from crop yields to human behaviour. What this means for privacy is still being figured out. Technologists and policy experts warn that we're moving toward a world where anonymity, at least outdoors, may be close to impossible. A single satellite may only pass overhead every few hours, but a network of them, properly timed and spaced, can turn the entire surface of Earth into a monitored zone. Some call this the global panopticon, a reference to a type of prison where guards can see every prisoner, but the prisoners don't know when they're being watched. The psychological result, according to that model, is self-censorship. People act as if they're always being watched, even if the cameras aren't focused on them at that moment. That idea, once just a metaphor, has started to show up in real life. Protesters in some countries now carry umbrellas or wear masks, though for now, this is generally done only to block facial recognition on the ground. As surveillance becomes more automatic, it also becomes harder to question. If human analysts once reviewed imagery to decide what mattered, now machine vision systems pick out patterns in real time. They don't just watch, they interpret. A person's heat signature, body posture, or car movement might be flagged by an algorithm trained to spot unusual behaviour. But the standards for what counts as unusual aren't always clear, and when a person is flagged, there may be no way to appeal or even know it happened. Some governments say this kind of capability is necessary. They argue that with growing instability, global health threats, and terrorism, it's important to see everything, everywhere, all the time. But others ask, at what cost? The promise of safety has often been used to justify invasions of privacy. And in a world where satellites are always watching, there may be little room left for personal secrets or dissent. Surveillance tools that start as protection can quickly become instruments of control. Legal frameworks for privacy were mostly built in an age of paper records, phone taps, and ground-level policing. Few laws cover satellite surveillance directly. Even fewer deal with automated satellite tracking, thermal data collection, or real-time population analysis from orbit. Some privacy advocates have tried to fill that gap. They've pushed for satellite imagery use policies, time delay requirements, or blurring rules for sensitive locations. Others are working on technical countermeasures. This includes adaptive camouflage that fools AI systems, spoofing technologies that scramble infrared signatures, or even public warning systems that notify communities when a surveillance satellite is overhead. A few activists speak about the idea of privacy sanctuaries, places both urban and rural designed to be invisible or unreadable to satellites. These might use architectural tricks to scatter heat, underground structures to block signals, or forest cover to confuse visual tracking. There are also proposals for digital sanctuary zones where people's data cannot be monitored or transmitted by satellite networks without consent. Still, these efforts remain small compared to the size and speed of surveillance growth. The sky gets denser each year, filled with watchers who may or may not be accountable. Each new generation of satellite spying has led to innovation on both sides. Spy satellites provoked counter-satellites. Image interpretation sparked camouflaging. Data surveillance birthed encryption. Each act of observation gave birth to an equal and opposite attempt at concealment. The question now is whether that pattern will hold. Can resistance scale as fast as the systems it resists? Can legal protections evolve as quickly as orbital networks? Can citizens understand what's watching them fast enough to build tools of defense before privacy disappears? Has this deep dive into the evolution of space surveillance capabilities expanded your horizons? Sound off in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing. Thanks for watching.